Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping rules. I would like to request everybody to please keep their cameras and mics switched off during the entire length of the webinar, unless, of course, if you are the speaker or there is a question answer session going on. All the questions can be typed in the Q&A box in the Zoom platform or in the comments section on Facebook. The question answer session will be at the end of the session, and the selected number of questions shall be addressed time permitting. We also request the speakers to kindly adhere to the time limit for their presentations. The anchor shall notify if the time limit exceeds. Welcome all the speakers, guests, and attendees for ICOMOS India's webinar on Future for the Modern Past, a heritage-led development for IIM Ahmedabad. This webinar is being organized by ICOMOS India's National Scientific Committee of 20th Century Heritage, in collaboration with ICOMOS India's Emerging Professional Working Group and West Zone. The institutional partner for this event is USM's Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies, Mumbai. Over 2 days, this webinar is going to be conducted for the 13th and 14th of April. Just a few words on our organizers and partners. This webinar is organized by ICOMOS India. It's now grown with a membership of 350 heritage professionals in approximately 6 zones in the country. This is a collaboration with ICOMOS India's National Scientific Committee of 20th Century Heritage, which has championed the cause of creating awareness and advocacy for 20th century heritage in the country. It is also in collaboration with ICOMOS India's Emerging Professional Groups, which was launched in 2019 to provide an enabling environment for emerging professionals in the field of heritage and culture. This is also in collaboration with ICOMOS India's West Zone, which is actively involved in events and publication, training and capacity building and advocacy. The site that we are today discussing, IIM Ahmedabad, is located in the West Zone. Our institutional partner, USM's Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies, is one of the few universities and Council of Architecture approved master courses at national level in the field of heritage conservation, and the only school for architectural and urban conservation in Mumbai. These are the 4 sessions spread across 2 days. Annabel Lopez, who is the National Scientific Committee 20th Century Coordinator, in her presentation shall explain the program in detail. So let's begin with the first technical session. The first session is about assessing cultural significance of IIM Ahmedabad. I am the session anchor. My name is Sanaeya Vandrewala. I'm a conservation architect, a part of NSC 20C, and also an assistant professor at Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute. Let me introduce to you the speakers. First is Professor Manoj Parmar. He's the director at USM's Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies, an academician and a practicing architect. Followed by Annabel Lopez, who's an architect, expert heritage management and planning, and heritage impact assessment. Followed by Prem Chandavarkar, managing partner at CNT Architects, an academic, writer, and a heritage advocate, and also chair and discussant for our today's first session. Kiran Joshi, architect, academic, author, and heritage advocate. Followed by Amit Srivastava, director at the Center of Asian and Middle Eastern Architecture, based at the University of Adelaide, Australia. William Whittaker, who's the curator of the Architectural Archives at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Rashmi Bansal, who's an alumni at IIMA, an MBA, author, and entrepreneur. And next on the list is Meenakshi Nath, who's also an alumni at IIMA, an expert in international development. So let's begin the first part with inviting Professor Manoj Parmar to speak about KRVIA's engagement in the field of heritage education and research. Professor Parmar.
Sanaeya for the introduction. I hope I am audible. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Greetings to all the speakers, analysts, and participants of this event. I am thankful to ICOMOS for organizing the event in collaboration with KRVIA. At KRVIA, this collaboration is central over all the academic endeavor in architecture and conservation in terms of role of history and heritage in contemporary times. KRVIA has always focused its pedagogic framework to learning, debating, and discussing history. KRVIA acknowledges the emerging contemporary discourse on architectural and urban conservation, newer debates, the shift that is visible in recent time, and it is very, very important for all of us. We at KRVIA believe that history is not a passive material, but a repertoire of ideas and propelling dynamo. Thus, a paradigmatic understanding of history brings sympathetic contemplation to what is contemporary. In larger context of history, as Professor Trevelyan said, history is not a subject at all, but a house in which all subjects dwells. Architectural history is a manifestation in whatever form depicts the priority of our time. Contemporary history is that part of history continuing as a living organism with us. This is, I think, this conference is very important, strengthening that debate. KRVIA is an important center for such conversation and engagement with history and heritage, constantly discussing and debating the question around what is heritage and what is critical practice of heritage. It is a compelling moment to state that idea of architecture is a contemporary history in making. This is how today's conference is so relevant. KRVIA, established in 1992, since then we have been engaging with history and heritage as a part of core curriculum. The documentation and representation of heritage has been central to academics. In the process, we have published several books talking about heritage of various kinds, ranging from architectural history, historical narrative, sacred geography, ecology, community rituals, and cultural practices. The first publication that we initiated, titled Context in Transition, this was way back in 1999, which attempted to document our on-site engagement with various documentation efforts. The documentations are part of academic curriculum over the first 4 years of architecture and first year of postgraduate program. The second publication carried out the documentation of GB Mahatre practice of Mumbai city. The publication titled Building That Shaped Bombay, edited by Kamu Iyer, who was then a part of KRVIA faculty and academic council member. The book documented the buildings built between 1930 to 1970. GB Mahatre was modernist who grew up from traditional beginning through an individualized version of Art Deco buildings in Mumbai. Such constant engagement with history and heritage led us to think about postgraduate program that constantly talks about the gap between heritage and development. The formation of postgraduate program in architectural and urban conservation, along with urban design, was a natural flow of our inquiry. The question of urban history and environment are unwavering components of architectural education at KRVIA. And recently, we have published an interesting book that is a work from Master Sate Bhuta. This was an indigenous practice once upon a time in Mumbai, and they have completed several projects which are so important in image building of the city. And this also reinforces our position in the city, the school which promotes history heritage, along with other aspects of architectural education. Coincidentally, we also had a interesting program this year, our annuals revolving around citizens' heritage and question of architectural values. We talked about, various aspects of history and heritage. KRVIA vision for coming year is embedded into our engagement with history. KRVIA in recent time begin to expand the nature of site documentation process with imagination of vision as a guidance, bring about theme on environmental history of heritage. With this note, I once again thank ICOMOS for collaboration with KRVI and concerned professionals. I'm sure that it shall enable us to propel the heritage-based academics significant direction. With this note, I would like to thank ICOMOS and I hand it over to Sanaeya. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parmar. Annabel?
Yes. Hello, everyone. As coordinator of the National Scientific Committee on 20th Century Architecture, ICOMOS India, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, Future for the Modern Past, Heritage-Led Development for IIM Ahmedabad. It's wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces and many new faces attending this webinar today. First, just a little bit about IIM Ahmedabad. The Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad was established as part of India's post-independence endeavors at strengthening and modernizing its social, economic, and cultural infrastructure. It was designed from 1962 to 1974 by one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, Louis Kahn, who worked in close collaboration with two celebrated Indian architects, B.V. Joshi and Anand. Despite the multiple constraints that they were faced with, the IIM Ahmedabad today is recognized as an icon of 20th century architecture and is a veritable masterpiece of human genius. However, despite this iconic status, the campus, unfortunately, is not legally protected as heritage. The next slide. Over the years, the old exposed brick, in fact, the reinforced brick buildings have begun to show signs of decay. A conservation and rehabilitation program, which was taken up by the management in 2016, was abandoned sometime in 2020. When the IIM authorities decided to demolish and replace most of the 14 dormitories with new students' housing, alarmed by this development, ICOMOS issued a worldwide heritage alert, which was prepared by NSC 20C ICOMOS India, to ask for the preparation of a comprehensive conservation management plan for the campus. There were a number of protests from across the world, and finally on January 1st, 2021, IIMA announced that the demolition plans were deferred. Next slide. However, in November 2022, IIM was again in the news when the Board of Governors announced that it had decided not to continue with any further restoration work, opting instead for a reconstruction of the faculty blocks, the classroom complex, and 3 peripheral dorms, with the same exterior facade, a seismically safe structure, and major renovation of the internal space to improve its functionality and to suit the need of the current users. Once again, ICOMOS, together with Docomomo International, reissued the Heritage Alert, calling for at least a comprehensive documentation of the campus before any intervention on the ground. While several heritage professional activists and the IIMA alumni continue to persuade the authorities to reverse their decision, an elaborate 34-page document authored by the then director of IIMA announcing plans for demolition underscores the urgent need for a dialogue on this topic, a need to bridge the gap between the concerns faced by heritage professionals like us and the needs of the management. There is an urgent need to create an awareness about the cultural significance of Louis Kahn's work. The next slide. So NSC 20C decided to hold this webinar primarily as an attempt to generate an open platform to bring together heritage professionals, the alumni, the management of IIM Ahmedabad, and anyone else interested so that we can deliberate on a credible course of action for the conservation of the old campus. It is very heartening to see the response that this webinar has drawn. As of yesterday, we had over 500 interested registrations, and I hope most of the people do join in today. A little bit about the structure of the webinar. The next slide, Sanaeya. It is spread over 2 days. We have 4 sessions in all. On the first day, session 1, working towards a value-based approach, assessing the cultural significance of IIM Ahmedabad, is designed to understand the cultural significance of the campus at the global level, national and the local level. This session will explore the community and associational meanings and values connected to living and learning and working at IIM. The aim is to recognize the interdependence of both the tangible and the intangible values while conserving built heritage. The second session for today, Managing Louis Khan's Legacy, will bring together experiences of conserving Louis Khan's built legacy the world over, showcasing varied approaches while understanding the adaptive transformation is rooted in an understanding of the structures, intentions, history, and significance. Then last slide. On day 2, that is tomorrow, we again have 2 sessions. The first session, Promoting, Protecting, and Conserving 20th Century Heritage, explores carefully chosen narratives of structural retrofit as well as reconstruction of 20th century structures built in brick, some in reinforced brick and concrete, but focusing largely on the material and structural issues as well as the construction of these buildings, the causes of decay and the state of conservation, and the conservation efforts that have been carried out to conserve these buildings. And the last session for the day, the concluding session of this webinar, will be a panel discussion titled The Way Forward. We have some eminent people representing various organizations in this last panel discussion, and this aims to gather opinions and technical input to disseminate the critical role of a value-based approach for identification of heritage assets. We hope to discuss the steps that can be considered to address some of the concerns that IIM is faced with, the risks posed to its authenticity and integrity with this proposed reconstruction, a debate on the various means of conserving its original buildings, perhaps on the campus, appropriate tools, if nothing else, for documentation, interpreting, and valorizing this built heritage of our recent past. Yeah, thank you. With this, I now invite Professor Kiran Joshi.
Hi, hello everyone. Prem Chandavarkar, the session chair, will take over.
So this opening session is foundational to the rest of the webinar across today and tomorrow. If you look at the IIM Ahmedabad website, there is great reverence expressed for what the genius of Louis Khan has offered the campus. And the website speaks about how his design instills awe and wonder in the viewer. But in recent decisions announced first in late 2021 and then again in late 2022, a decision is announced to demolish major parts of the Khan legacy at IIMA, citing only practical considerations of material deterioration. What seems to have abruptly vanished from the discussion is awe and wonder. And we need to ask, what are we leaving behind as irretrievable loss if we demolish? There is no consideration of how we can retain those qualities that are central to the identity of IIMA thus far. So we need clarity on this, for this is precisely what should guide all future action and thought. So this opening session, titled The Cultural Significance of IIM Ahmedabad, promises to offer this clarity. We are fortunate to have speakers who bring professional expertise and discernment to bear on the issue, as well as speakers who can imbue their expertise with lived experience of inhabiting the Khan campus. As we have a lot of ground to cover, I request each speaker to stick to the allocated time of 15 minutes, except for Kiran Joshi, our opening speaker, who is also one of the organizers of this event, and therefore tasked with the added responsibility of sharing material received from IIM Ahmedabad. So since she has to add this to her presentation, she is given 20 minutes. To all speakers, before your time is up, 3 minutes before your time is up, you will hear this warning bell.
Good job.
And I hope you all heard that.
No.
Oh. Did you hear it? Okay, then if you're not hearing it, I'll just say 3 minutes.
Okay.
And then another bell signifying that you have 1 minute to wind up. And at the end of the time allotted, I will need to intervene to keep things moving. So with that, we all look forward to what promises to be a rich discussion. And I request our first speaker, Kiran Joshi, to begin her presentation.
Okay. I suppose I can share screen. Yeah. There goes. I've had a hard time trying to figure out the title of my project, my presentation. So essentially, we are starting to assess the significance of the built heritage. And I also have tried to incorporate the IIMA management's views and concerns, largely those of its former director, Errol D'Souza. So here goes. Sorry, let me put it on full screen. Yeah. Okay, to continue with what Annabel talked about, that is the objectives of the webinar. As we said, as she's already explained, inclusivity is inbuilt into the whole event. That is how we started. So the event is primarily an attempt to bring together various stakeholders, heritage professionals, advocates, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately for us, despite repeated requests, we did not get any response from the current director of the IIMA. Errol D'Souza did respond and has very kindly agreed that I present my own interpretation of whatever writings have been put forth by him and sometimes the Board of Governors of the IIM. So one of the things that I want to point out here, this is his famous 34-page tract, as he calls it, and he refers to the Jain theory of Anekantvad, which essentially means that every object, every situation has a number of realities, and you cannot just view something from only one angle, and therefore everybody has to get together. I only wanted to point out that what the objective of our particular webinar is very close to what he's trying to promote, that it's very important that everybody gets together, a number of stakeholders offering a variety of viewpoints, sometimes opposing, sometimes conflicting, but it is important that they get together to resolve a difficult situation. Going on from there, let me, kind of get back to the subject of this particular session, that is assessing significance. And I, having been a career teacher all my life, can't help but come into the teaching mode most of the time. So one of the ways that we can assess significance is from the origin of the IIM and why it was founded. And as we all know, some of the information I'm giving may be already known to everybody, but I'm just repeating it for continuity's sake and for storytelling. The IIM, as you know, was founded as a self-sufficient 65-acre campus, which would have an academic core, a dining hall for students and faculty, and housing for the staff, as well as the students and the faculty. As Annabel has already said, this was established by Government of India in 1961 as part of its post-independence, nation building, and modernization programs. The second aspect, which is very important when we consider its significance, that's an intangible one. It is the result of a collaboration between various local visionaries, including, the famous Vikram Sarabhai, whose daughter would be with us tomorrow, the central and the state governments, and the Ford Foundation, as well as the Harvard Business School. And lastly, one always considered the fact that this was designed by one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, Louis Kahn, who was ably supported by two other celebrated Indian architects, that's Balakrishna Joshi and Anantraji. The campus, as you know, therefore, is generally said to have two components. One is the old campus, which was built by Louis Kahn during his lifetime, designed and built by Louis Kahn during his lifetime. And then the second part, the one which is marked in yellow here, the second part, which is kind of whatever was built after Khan's death, that is from between 1975 to 99 under the leadership of Anantraji. So now comes the next story. When we talk about issues of origin and growth, the institute is growing, and in that process, certain buildings were demolished, and this story goes back to way back to 2019, that is 4 years ago. Okay, some of these housings, as you can see in this particular image here, some of the housing were demolished, and a British architect tweeted about it. He reported that there is an ongoing demolition of Louis Kahn's faculty housing in Ahmedabad. The statement was contradicted by IIM, specifically Professor Errol de Souza, who said that the buildings demolished were not designed by Louis Kahn, but came much later. So this raises some of our questions. That when we talk about significance, does the major significance or the basic significance of the IIM rest primarily on its association with Louis Kahn, or are there other ways of looking at it? We also, when we started this webinar, and even earlier, there was lots of discussion of whether we should be looking only at Louis Kahn's work or also that of Kahn, or also that of Raje. But is that enough? Do we need to look beyond that as well? So we have other expressions of this popular notion of heritage and significance. Going back in history, the design for a new 39-acre complex outlined here in blue was approved in 2001, and then later in 2013 and 14, a 25-year-old master plan for development of the old campus was put forth to allow for additional academic programs, number of students, faculty, staff, etc. And simultaneously with it came the project for restoring what was then perceived as heritage. That is Louis Kahn School building and the student dormitories. As you can see in the plan here, almost all of the remaining buildings of the campus were to be demolished and removed. So that brings us to the next thing, that this is the area which was built during Khan's lifetime. And this thing in the second picture, the area marked yellow is the contribution of Joshi Raje after Louis Kahn. And of course, the third larger picture shows the entire old campus, which is talking about the legacy of Kahn as well as Joshi and Raje. But still, the question that I'd like to ask is that does IIMA's heritage significance rest only on its association with architects, even well-known ones or famous ones as they are? Or do people think that this is how the conservation professionals identify heritage and its significance? To me, this particular way of the way of identifying heritage becomes very important, because as I deduce it, as I perceive it, this has been one of the major problems with conserving. This has been one of the major problems, not the only problem in the conservation process for the IIMA. And related to this is the question which has been asked by Errol de Souza in his 34th-page tract. So he says, another thing that has come forth, he says, it is pertinent to raise the question, who is the author of the first building? The premise is, of course, based on the fact that it is only the architect, the value of the architect, or how famous the architect is. That is the only thing which will decide whether or not the campus is significant. And he draws our attention to the fact that it was not just Khan, but Joshi as well as Raje and other architects, the local architects, who worked equally on the project. And should then the legacy of architecture of the building be attributed only to Khan? Going on with this, we come to the present year, 2023, and we find this question of identity, this question of significance acquires even greater complexity. And in this particular tract that we're talking about, right on the first page, the first section is of the identity of the object. And Errol D'Souza traces various things, how buildings have been changed with time, how many parts had to be replaced on account of these becoming unserviceable or decaying or whatever, something like that. There is a huge description of that. And this is one of the main problems that we are discussing. So he says, over time, it has become difficult to identify the structure with the original creativity that was manifested in the building associated with the architects. So whether a Louis Kahn building can still be called one after many of its original parts have been replaced. Now, this is a very strange and important question, and I don't know if we would be able to answer this, or whether it needs to be answered right now or remains a question for the future. So again, how do we define heritage and assess significance? Can we arrive at a consensus? We must try. The next part of assessing significance, I'm going over it very quickly, is very common, that we begin to look at the design intent and whether there is any value in retaining that or promoting that or valorizing that. And of course, as we all know, there were these three thematic principles. The first being that IIMA was conceived as a close-knit and a single entity with functional and visual linkages between these three main components: the school building, the dormitories, and the faculty housing. The design intent also is the first principle of this are what he calls as the notions of extended learning, that all parts, the student dormitories and the teaching blocks, these two are linked through a series of corridors, arched corridors, and landscapes. And the idea being that the students, with the kind of education system which was being promoted at the IIMA, that students would take the dialogue into non-academic spaces as well. However, what I've given below is a kind of my conclusion or my interpretation of what Errol D'Souza feels about it. And he says the concept of meeting he contends has become outdated, and therefore the design intent has kind of lost its relevance. And given the widespread use of digital devices and so on, students now prefer to work in isolation. So the whole idea of meeting and community spaces, to him, while justifying the demolition of this, has been kind of pronounced. The second important thematic principle was that of climate sensibility. And of course, the design is based on the correct orientation as a response to prevailing sun, heat, wind, light, rain, dust, etc., all of which became the basis for the underlying geometry of the site plan and the building design. Okay. And in fact, we know that after the first site plan was made, a new one was kind of devised to utilize the sea-west breeze. The continued validity of this value can hardly be contested, especially today when we are talking about energy saving and sustainability and whatnot. I don't see anyone who could justify that no, students today prefer to use air conditioners, and therefore this plan is not required. The third one, and to me the most important one, and the bone of contention, came into play a little after the project had become. And after a while, Khan decided that instead of using concrete, he would engage only with the locally produced brick at a basic level, extending himself much beyond a mere adoption of the indigenous vocabulary, and invent a unique structural and visual grammar that is now recognized as being of outstanding value. More would be talked about this by Amit, and much of what I've learned is through his thesis project. Throughout thesis dissertation, the PhD dissertation, throughout the project, we know that Khan was to remain committed to a reassembly of these traditional components and aesthetics. And some images here of how, the Khan's decision to build exclusively in a brick generated a new vocabulary, how he reinterpreted tradition, and so on and so forth. And the humble handmade brick became the focal point of the entire thing. And ironically, as I said, this very unique attribute, and to me the most fascinating one, because it is less talked about than all the other attributes of this place, has also become its bane. So a little bit of why I call it that. It's not exactly a significance, maybe it is, kind of, and we are talking maybe also about the threats that are posed. So the major cause of degradation, this is deduced not only from the conservation architects reports, the reports submitted by the IIT Roorkee, who were commissioned, and also something else here and there. So the major causes are inherent defects in original material and construction techniques, which is considered very serious. And then, of course, faulty repair methods and the lack of routine maintenance. The other signs of decay are rising dams, seepage of water, damaged pointing, abscess, and so on and so forth, which will be tackled later on as well. So I won't go into this in detail. But what is important here is that while the conservation efforts are reported to be largely satisfactory, the IIT Roorkee report also says that even the restored buildings have begun to show fresh areas of distress and decay. Since the inherent effects in the original material and techniques are quite serious, it seems, from the reports, one doesn't know. So this is really a cause of concern. So the question then I ask is that how does one contend with the decay of a seemingly unrepairable construction, but one that represents a major value of the built heritage of IIMA? And maybe this is something that we can consider in the last session. That is when we are talking about the way forward. The part 4 of assessing significance, that is the functional elements of the building, the 3 major elements, the classroom block, which comprises the library, classrooms, faculty block, etc., and its characteristics. The second, the dormitories, admittedly, or I think unquestionably, the best part of the whole thing, and why a particular kind of design was adopted, the significance of this design, their form, and so on and so forth, the concept behind it. And finally, the faculty houses, the faculty and staff houses, all of them, all share a plan based on not only the structural adequacy of the brick, the economy, and also the climate. Now I come to the part 5, which has taken me much more time than anything else, because it meant going through all the documents which I could find, which were
3 minutes left, Kiran.
Yeah. And this is the last slide. So last but one. So when we talk about the management's concern, which I'm doing on their behalf, essentially I could only find three aspects. One was their concern for providing a safe environment for the users, which is born out of the feeling that the residual life of the buildings is over, rehabilitation is not possible, and there is any day anything can fall and injure people. And therefore, a building must be safe, provide a healthy and work and stay environment, and free from exposure to hazards and all. And the second is that the buildings have become functionally obsolete. And therefore, it is important, since they can't be upgraded, we have to have new buildings to meet the current living and learning standards. And of course, he always says he thinks that conservation architects are only talking about aesthetics and going back to the origin. But he says a building is a lived-in object, and it is incorrect to reduce it merely to its aesthetic aspects and historical value, and so on and so forth. And there is one brief mention of the shortage of land for further expansion. which to him is justifying that the existing buildings can be demolished. When we wrote the Heritage Alert, which was almost 2 years ago now, basically we had put together only 3 aspects of the statement of significance. One, it is important as a post-colonial act of nation building and modernization. Second, the product of local and global to local partnership and cultural exchange. And of course, the outstanding architectural engineering approach and a unique design that is there. Okay. But I think today we must also take into account the 4th value, which is the use value, take into account perceptions of obsolescence, risk to property and life, the economics, which has not been mentioned somehow, of conservation versus longevity of restored properties, and so on and so forth. And being a teacher, I think I would also like to stress on the education value, the lessons the place has and its history of being and unbeing, the lessons it holds for the present and the future generations. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Kiran. We now go to our next speaker, Mr. Amit Srivastava, who will speak on the intangible heritage of material narratives of the IIMA. So, Mr. Srivastava, you have 15 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Prem. Unfortunately, I'm unable to share my video. It says unable to start video. Oh, all right. Okay, good. Thank you. I hope you can see and hear me, and you can see the slides as well. So thank you first to everybody at ICOMOS for organizing the event. I think it's a really important discussion. And thank you, Kiran, for that introduction as well. I think some of those questions that you've raised, I'm trying to answer as well. So hopefully we'll be able to progress the discussion on that. But before I start with that, I just want to sort of clarify, I'm not a conservation architect, but I am a historian, architectural historian. And so about 15 years ago, I had a chance to write a detailed history of the early design and construction of IIM. And I'm kind of building on the work that I did at that stage. So maybe I'll be able to bring in some bits of information that might be useful. My talk is titled Intangible Heritage of Material Narratives. And the reason I've chosen to talk about that is, I guess a lot of people, especially with the second session, a lot of people are going to talk about Louis Kahn's design legacy. And I want to move away from that and talk about other kinds of narratives that are connected to this. And I want to particularly talk about this decision of making the building out of brick and the impact that has had not only on Ahmedabad's building culture, but also on the broader thinking around architecture around the world. So with that, I'm going to go back a little bit into the historical context just to position a few things. And I think Kiran already raised the issue of the involvement of Ford Foundation and the government and the Harvard Business School. But I do want to highlight that Ahmedabad was not the first choice for the IIM. And when the Ford Foundation was established in 1952 with the New Delhi field office, and they commissioned the Robbins report in 1959, the intention actually was to build this in Bombay. And I think it's important to recognize this because even with the meeting that was there between the Minister Mazumdar, Harry Hansen from Harvard Business School, and Swinger from Ford Foundation, was not really focused on Ahmedabad. And it was not until the splitting of the Bombay state into Maharashtra and Gujarat, which happened in 1960, and the huge implication that is there of the important work that people like Vikram Sarabhai, Kasturbhai Lalbhai, but also others who were part of that sort of process, like Chinubhai Chimanbhai and Sarottam Hathi Singh and all those people who brought IIM to Ahmedabad and worked very hard to make Ahmedabad the center of education and development in India. And I think that's an important part of the story and an important part of the legacy of the IIM project. And the reason I'm going on about that, because I think it's mostly also connected to this very important point, is that Louis Kahn was not the main project architect at the start of the process. And B.V. Joshi was the consulting architect, but the National Institute of Design was the project architect. And the formation of the National Institute of Design is an important thing to understand in this context, because when Eames wrote the India report in 1958, the acquisition of National Institute of Design as a place became this important thing for Ahmedabad and its design culture, where National Institute of Design as the project architect would then build IIM, and B.V. Joshi involved Louis Kahn as a teaching consultant almost in that process of building capacity within National Institute of Design. So this brings us to two things. Firstly, the legacy of that teaching within the Ahmedabad culture, but also the team at NID, the architects that Kiran was talking about, the Indian architects who were involved in this process. So again, as Kiran highlighted, even when Louis Kahn was originally involved, the building that he was imagining was very much in line with what he was doing in Dhaka at the time, and imagining to build in concrete. And we can see that in the early designs in the early part of 1963. And it was not until the members from the NID team who actually went to Philadelphia in late 1963 that the transformation happens, and Louis Kahn sort of changes and accepts the fact that he's going to build in the local material of brick. So the agency of these people from the NID team is an important one to consider in the development of that. In fact, when the construction began for the first dormitories in 1964, Louis Kahn was not in India, and these were done on the details that were developed by the NID team here. And I'm not going to get into detail of that, but it's an interesting one to see, because even today, if you go and look at the D6 and D12 dormitories, which were the first dormitories to build, you can see that the bonding pattern is different than the other dormitories. And it sort of is a very important part of finding out that history of transition that happened within the development of the team, and the knowledge and transfer that happened between Louis Kahn, Philadelphia office, and the development of the team at NID. And I particularly want to focus on this particular instance, which is in December 1964, Louis Kahn comes to Ahmedabad, and there's this entire discussion about the architectural construction process. And they are involved in the production of this thing, which was called the experimental arch. If you go down into the campus, this still exists. And the whole idea was to go back to the basics and reconsider brick as a material, understand it not as an imposition of Louis Kahn's idea, but as something that was developing with the capacity of the masons, the bricklayers, the engineers on the site, everybody together. And this is a very important thing to understand, that IIM in that sense is not just Louis Kahn's creation sitting in Ahmedabad, it's a creation of Ahmedabad, which is directed in certain ways by Louis Kahn. And it transfers the people of Ahmedabad, but also transfers the way Louis Kahn looks at architecture. So from my perspective, this kind of network of intangible heritage is important, because we're not just sort of seeing this as an imposition of Louis Kahn's sort of design. There's a whole lot of players involved, and all of them bring really important things to it. So again, I'm not going to get into detailed history of that, but here, for instance, the NID team is really important, with characters like Satsangi, Sen Kapadia, Narale, Padmakar Karve. They were all involved in developing a complete new drawing convention, which was unlike anything that Kahn's Philadelphia office was doing, and different from what Joshi's office was doing. And this entire process was developed, of course, in conversation with Louis Kahn, but it was something that defined the way the project developed. And also going back to that idea of the experimental arch, we also start seeing a greater role played by the sort of site supervisors from Gannon Dunkerley, so particularly S.B. Desai, S.K. Dalal, and mostly Barucha, who was not very well trained, but he had this very intuitive capacity to deal with brick, and he was able to solve a lot of details on the site. And this has been, when I did my interviews at the time now, about 15 years ago, this came up again and again in discussion of the contributions of these people who then define what brick architecture in Ahmedabad becomes. And this is not just at the level of the contractors and supervisors, but also down to the bricklayers. And so there's detailed sort of interviews that I did with people like Natubhai, Dadabhai Thakur, Koridas ji, Jadav ji, all of these people who contributed to the project. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that the project in itself then becomes embedded into the culture of building in Ahmedabad. And we can see that in many places because just as NID is helping, the team at NID is helping build IIM, at the same time, NID is also building its own building. And if you go today and you can see this fabulous brick shell structure, which is at NID, which was actually developed in collaboration with some of the same bricklayers who were working on the IIM project. And on the broader framework of looking at Ahmedabad's development, what you can also see at the same time, if you look through the records of the Ahmedabad Brickmakers Association, 45 new brickmakers emerged in that 2 to 3 year period with new kilns in Wadaj, Ghatlodia, Chandlodia, Bhat, all sorts of places. So it's a transformation of the entire city that is happening on the basis of this project. So the project, its roots sort of extends all the way out throughout the sort of building culture of Ahmedabad. And for my colleagues who might talk maybe in the next session about the design legacy of Khan, it's easy to sort of see that after Khan does this and he goes back and over the next couple of years, he designs the Ayub Hospital, the Dominican Mother's House, the Fine Arts project in Fort Wayne. All of these have a direct reference to what he's been doing in Ahmedabad. And the interesting thing is that at least a couple of those projects, he sends the drawings to Ahmedabad for the NID team to look at and sort out the details before it's sent back. So not only is the impact happening on the building culture in Ahmedabad, it is also starting to affect Louis Kahn's future work. And as we are aware, so the idea of looking at the IIM project as Louis Kahn working with the NID team and with people from Joshi's office to build a capacity or a way of thinking about materials of construction, but not also in the sense that Louis Kahn's coming in and dictating that idea based on his own practice. He's coming in and he's developing that with the people here, I think is an important part to consider how deeply this project is embedded into the culture or the building culture of Ahmedabad. So getting to the issue of intangible heritage, the idea is that intangible heritage is both physical and associational. And if you sort of pay attention to the narratives through these stories, through these memories, which we try to capture, the invaluable insights into the psychological bonds that these people have with these places, that also tends to define the heritage value. So in that sense, IIMA is not just the building structure itself, but the narrative that it links it to Ahmedabad's building culture. Now, speaking of narrative, there is a second really important implication of this project that I want to sort of highlight, and I know I have limited time, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. And going back to the experimental arch, and there's a very interesting, at least for anybody who's been in an architecture school and has heard about this very famous dialogue between Louis Kahn and the brick, where Kahn is asking the brick what it wants, and the brick is being recalcitrant, and it says, "I want an arch," even though, you know, Louis Kahn wants to make a concrete lintel over it. And people use it within architectural education, but for many years, they've kind of used it as a metaphor to try and understand how we can use materials. But many years have passed, and over a period of time, we've started recognizing that Kahn was trying to communicate something else about the entire construction and building process. And this idea of the recalcitrant object is an argument against hylomorphism or a way of thinking about how we deal with objects in construction. The interesting thing is that in the same year that Louis Kahn supposedly has this dialogue with the brick, Gilbert Simonton is writing this. Yeah, sure. So Simonton is writing about the same idea of against hylomorphism in his book. And he also talks about, interestingly, about the idea of brick making and bricklaying as a way of understanding this relationship with the object world. It's not until the 1990s that people like Bruno Latour start arguing for the fact that there is an agency of the material that is revealed in the process of making. And he starts talking about reinstating that symmetry of humans and non-humans. And I don't want to get into the philosophical context of this, but it's really important to understand how central Louis Kahn's dialogue with the brick is to this process. Because by 2013, we now also have anthropologists like Tim Ingold talking about the act of making and this notion of correspondence, where how we deal with raw materials and substances and how we all work together towards bringing potentials. And this interpretation of Louis Kahn's sort of narrative continues. And this is just to give an example from my work, which was in 2009, Ingold's work in 2013, and it still continues today. So in 2020, for instance, and 22, literally last year in December, there was a published thesis now starting to look at the neuroscientific experience of this thing that Louis Kahn was talking about and how it helps us understand this capacity. And in the 2020 publication, Matthias Karholm writes, what Kahn ultimately produced was not the essence of brick architecture, but something that nurtured the plurality of social institutions, including the brick makers. So this narrative is sort of absolutely embedded within the structure of Ahmedabad and its building culture. So kind of bringing it all back in, the point I want to make is intangible heritage is both physical and associational. So even though we're talking about these narratives, these memories, these histories, the IIM building is still the touchstone for us to give value to these things, to explain this to people and to continue to interpret why we should think about brick as a material or the process of construction or architecture in a certain way. And the building of IIM Ahmedabad is an embodiment of that process, a process that is not just, you know, an architectural shelter for people to use, but also a process of interpreting and understanding what architecture and construction means. And the impact this has had on understanding architecture, whether it's an architectural education or the broader philosophical literature, I think is immeasurable and intangible in that sense, but is also related back to the building that exists. And I think it's really important for us to figure out how we can maintain those legacies and move that forward. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Our next speaker is William Whitaker, but I'm not sure if he's joined. Can someone let us know if he's there or not?
He hasn't joined, Prem. So we can go next speaker.
Okay, so then we'll move on to people who can give us expertise on the matter, but also experience of actually having lived and inhabited the IIMA campus. And we start with Rashmi Bansal. Over to you, Rashmi. You have 15 minutes. Is Rashmi here? I was told she had joined.
Yes, she's here.
Ma'am, Rashmi ma'am is not here.
I just saw her. She was there.
Yes, ma'am, she had joined the meeting, but she's not here currently.
Okay.
Okay, then we'll move on to Meenakshi Nath, who's speaking on perplexing perspectives, unpacking stakeholder differences and valuing architectural heritage at IIM Ahmedabad.
Thanks. This is the title, as you said. I'm just capturing IIMA's narrative, the way we've heard it, as alumni. Kiran Doshi's already done some of that, but what we've heard is that, yes, it's the architecture that has made IIMA what it is today, an apex level institution. But unfortunately, the restoration plans have to be abandoned because they are technically impractical. And the other issue which Kiran also mentioned was the functional needs of students and how IIMA felt that they had evolved and that the old design didn't address those. And the mention of business plans and expansion. Now, the other thing that IIMA did was that they said it's a structural safety issue and only we are responsible for student safety. So it kind of meant that, they were the ones who had to take the final call on what needs to be done. And I know I've spoken to stakeholders who actually did feel that this was an inhibiting factor in them pushing IIMA in one direction or another, because if they push them in the direction of restoration and a student was injured, then, how would that go? So that was, one of IIMA's kind of points of communication. Now, in terms of technical support, as so many of you and your organizations had offered support to IIMA after the, news of the demolition of the dorms leaked out through the tender. There were so many offers of support from all over the world, as well as from Indian institutions. And in fact, even alumni, Rashmi, myself, and a larger group of alumni, some of whom are technical experts in the area, because some are civil engineers, some have gone into construction. We had put together a package and offered technical support, but all those have been refused by IIMA. And finally, IIMA never did say that it was a financing issue, which I think is a point to be noted, because quite a few alumni assumed that was the case. This is the map of the campus buildings that I'm at least looking at during this presentation. These were all meant to be restored, let's say before the news broke in 2020. But the story changed in 2020 and it changed in 22. So I just want to go over that a little bit. As we know, Dorm 15 and the library were restored. Dorm 15 was a pilot. It was picked because it was the worst dorm, and we were supposed to learn lessons that inform the restoration of the other dorms. So both those have been restored during this period. And in fact, both these have been in use since 2017 and 18 respectively. And whether in 20 or in 22, the decision regarding these two buildings didn't change, and they are going to continue to be used in the foreseeable future, which is very good news. However, dorms, the classrooms and the faculty blocks were actually already being restored in 2020 when the news broke, and they were going to, there was no change in that decision in 2020, but in 22, in November, IIMA has decided that these also have to go in terms of being demolished, but they will be rebuilt in a similar design with the brick facade and non-major structural changes. And in fact, the restoration teams that were working there have, I think, been asked to wind up right in November. Let's come to the dorms now. Dorms 16 to 18 were going to be restored even in 2020. Professor Errol D'Souza explained in a long letter to the alumni that they would do what it takes to restore these dorms because they were external facing, because you see them when you enter the campus. However, dorms 1 to 14 would be redeveloped. And if you see the tender document, you will know that the design is as per dorm 33, which is, I mean, the last few dorms that were built, 33 is, I think, the last one. If the one that was completed by 2021, it has an attached toilet, a balcony, it's got a larger space, etc. So the tender seems to refer to that design, and they would expand the built capacity by 60% in terms of student rooms, and they also were considering an ancillary building along with that. So that was in the tender. Now, the decision on dorms 1 to 14 hasn't changed, whether in 2020 or 22. But dorm 16, 17, 18 that were going to be restored are now going to be rebuilt in a similar design, just like classrooms and faculty block. I'm sorry for this slightly complicated thing, but I mean, the main thing is that external facing buildings and the Louis Kahn Plaza, the buildings adjoining the Louis Kahn Plaza are going to retain the design and the brick facade, which were already there, some because they've been restored and some because they're going to be replicated. However, what IIMA calls the inner core, which is dorms 1 to 14, are going to be dramatically changed in terms of their, they're not going to have brick facade, they're going to be contemporary in design, and basically it sounds like they're going to be more like the new campus. So yeah, the other thing was all this was linked mainly to the issue of structural safety, though the student preferences as well as expansion were mentioned. Expansion was mentioned quite briefly, actually, in most of the announcements as a driver for all this to be done. So this is where I think the differential values come in, because external facing, I mean, we all alumni love iconic Louis Kahn Plaza for the venue it offers our grand events like conventions, etc. But actually what links us to each other and back to the campus is the dormitories. And people will come to reunions if dorm mates are coming and won't come if they're not. You know, these are the people who have linked us to better careers, linked us in life, given us friendship. So even a reunion as recently as December, 10-year reunion, around 60-70% of the people who turned up were from the old campus and only 30% from the new campus, even though roughly similar number of students study in both. So, I mean, we value both the inner core as well as the external facing. And actually, so do new students, you know, the current students, and Rashmi is going to talk about that in her presentation. The other differentiation is the functional benefits, you know, the toilets, etc. Whereas students value the inspiring architecture, because Rashmi and I had done a survey of 103 students in 2021, and she's going to talk about it. But 80% of them didn't want to give up the inspiring architecture for attached toilets. But I think what has happened is that IIMA, you know, the old campus hasn't been maintained all that well. As a result, a lot of students were wanting to shift from the old campus to the new campus because of just decaying rooms, etc. But actually, if you ask them, do you prefer a renovated dormitory like 15 or would you like dorm 33? They prefer dorm 15 because dorm 15 is comfortable and fixed. Basically, it's been renovated and is comfortable and inspiring at the same time. And of course, the other thing that comes out quite clearly is that growth plans are also kind of superseding the legacy value by IIMA. And we felt that actually it's location of the dorms and growth plans rather than structural safety that were determining the fate of heritage buildings. So some of the emerging questions for us were that if IIT Roorkee had assessed library and dorm 15 to be, you know, those were the only two buildings assessed, yet they were going to be in use and they had been in use already. Why did that lead to the decision to not restore others and stay with them? I mean, it seems a bit contradictory. The second was, could a lessons learned, you know, exercise that should have followed Dorm 15 improve outcomes for the next round of restoration, and expert advice could really help with that. And finally, the IIT Roorkee actually report doesn't recommend demolition. It doesn't really give us data on longevity or cost benefit or any of those issues. By itself, it cannot really lead to a decision to demolish. So what else? What was the evidence? What was the other evidence? And of course, if restoration isn't feasible at all, which is hard to believe because these days you can apparently restore anything, then why not replicate all of it? And why are we going for redevelopment? Where is this recent drive to expand coming from? Now, some further questions were these, that, you know, the IIMA is doing a lot of complicated, taking a lot of complex decisions in restoration, as well as expanding hugely on the built infrastructure side. Yes, yet there is no infra or civil expert amongst the decision makers in the building committee or the governing council. Unlike, let's say, IIM Indore, which is spending half as much, doesn't have a restoration challenge, and yet they have 3 very credible experts amongst them. Second issue was for us that the building committee actually didn't have alumni, and none of them had lived in the dorms, which we felt was kind of, you know, they wouldn't perhaps appreciate the value it brings. And though, Errol has referred to students and their needs, actually they haven't spoken to them, and I've discussed this with him. They haven't actually asked them for their views. I'm going to rush through these questions. There are quite a few. We don't have an alumni association, so any group that gets together is a bit ad hoc, really, and it makes engagement a bit difficult, and really a concern about the reluctance of IMA to share information. Just to give you a context on what's happening on the built infrastructure side in Ahmedabad, it's been, I suppose most of you are aware that, HCP Design was the master architect for IMA, and they've made a 25-year plan of very ambitious kind of expansion, going from 1,000 to 2,000 students without actually redeveloping Dorm 1 to 14. So why do we have to do it? Why are we deviating from this plan, which is already delivered 1.4 million square feet additional in just one phase, and 4 phases still remain? Now, just a very small point on IMA governance. It's autonomous, which is great, but the governing council has nominees that are selected by the governing council themselves. So it's self-selecting, and they're not really representatives of the alumni or faculty. There are limited mechanisms, even though they're government owned, to be held accountable, really, because they're autonomous. They do come under Right to Information Act. So eventually all the information that underpins these decisions will come out. It's really very important upon IMA as a custodian of this architecture, to be really scrupulous and very transparent in its decision making. I'm not going to talk about this. And our submissions are that it's an irrevocable loss. Dorms are integral to our pedagogical philosophy, which is focused on group work, case work, etc. And students are valuing the inspiring role that the architecture is playing in their residential experience there. Alumni can bring in a lot of expertise. I mean, usually, institutions look at alumni mainly for funds, but actually as management experts, civil engineers who are also MBAs, we can bring in a lot of expertise. There's a lot of convening value. So please use us. Restore what's feasible and replicate what isn't, and to reassess the recent growth imperative. Perhaps we can look for creative solutions that address some of the recent growth imperatives that may have come, which we aren't really aware of. If IMA could share what those are beyond the 25-year master plan. And actually, we don't have a master architect at the moment. So it would be actually good to get a master architect who could look at these and kind of look at how this all fits in with the 25 overall plan. So yeah, this is, if you want to get in touch, these are our emails. We formed a group together for IMA, and we are on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. Thanks, Prem.
Thank you, Meenakshi, for lots of the quality of your presentation, and also for sticking to time. I think Rashmi Bansal is here with us now, so I request her to start the presentation. You have 15 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
If you can go to full screen.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really participating just as a layman, as a person who actually lived in the Louis Kahn dorm. So in a sense, I'm representing all the generations of IIM Ahmedabad students who have, sort of taken it for granted. I mean, I know today we realize that we had a very special experience. We had a campus that was different from everyone else. But honestly, at that stage, we just thought this is how things are. And, we just lived there, and I just want to share what that experience was like. So in fact, before joining IIM Ahmedabad, I had gone to IIT Bombay to give my interview for IIM Bangalore, and I stayed overnight with a friend who was studying there. And I had been very excited about actually the prospect of joining a hostel, but when I saw her, hostel building, it was this PWD construction kind of ceiling paint and a very small little room with a tiny window, not very well maintained. The bathrooms were really stinky. Everything about it was not attractive. So that's what I was expecting when I actually came to IIM Ahmedabad, that all hostels are like that, and that's what you have to be prepared for. So I was just pleasantly, surprised, shocked, and elated to find the kind of campus that we, had in Ahmedabad. And from the very first day, you just felt that you were joining something which was just unique and different because of the program, but also because of the building. The built space was something which just spoke to you. And I remember walking through those arches and feeling that, I'm part of something that's so much bigger than me. I felt like I have to strive and, reach for, becoming somebody who's worthy of being here. So I think, in a sense, it was intimidating, but actually when we went and lived in the dorms were not intimidating at all. The, Louis Kahn Plaza is grand and, it's imposing. But when we go and live in the dorms, those were really intimate spaces. And in a very short while, all of us got very closely bonded to each other. If you've seen the dorms, the way they are designed, they are, when you open your door, it's like 5 rooms on this, on what, one plane, and a 90 degrees angle are another 5 rooms. So the moment you open your room, you have to interact with other people. It's not one long corridor like a hotel room. So it was designed to create interaction, create conversations. There was a common space where we had a carom board, we had some notice board. I've seen other hostels. I'm not saying people don't bond there, but there was something a little extra, in terms of bonding as far as IIM Ahmedabad dorms were concerned. And I think it's really something that even today we feel is integral to the whole experience of having studied there. The friendships we've made there, they've lasted for 3 decades and probably, till we leave this world. And it's very rare to have these kind of close bondings. And somewhere in every picture we have, there's always the brick walls are a part of the story. Every picture, every memory I have is connected with those brick walls. And when we were studying there at that time, the insides were not plastered. Right now, I think the inside of the room has been plastered. At that time, even the rooms were just plain brick walls. So I think literally I feel the dorms talk to each other, the people talk to each other. It was, you peep out, you see other people, you're not isolated ever. Now, 30 years later, like in February 2021, Meenakshi and I went back to see with our own eyes, like what is going on? What is this, change that's happened in the dorms? So I went back to see my old room, and, we also decided to stay for 3 nights in the dorm 9. We stayed in the basement, which was empty. And what we realized was that there's nothing, we didn't feel unsafe or any, anything wrong with the dorms, but the way that they had been maintained was very poor. Literally the Godrej cupboard inside this room, when you opened it, it was creaking and making like terrifying noises. So it almost felt like in the last 30 years, they've not done any upgradation of the, something as basic as furniture. So when the management says that, students are unhappy with living here, obviously even I would be unhappy if I had this kind of a cupboard and this kind of a curtain and this kind of, rickety furniture. And these are things which could easily be rectified. But on the whole, it was very clear that there's just no lack of, there's no thought put into maintaining this beautiful campus. Let alone a heritage structure. Any kind of campus should not have this kind of maintenance where pipes are sticking out from somewhere where, moss is growing. You obviously have to have a dedicated team of people. And if you don't maintain something for 20, 25 years, it is going to fail. But as such, the structure looked pretty wonderfully strong, and it didn't feel any different from what we experienced, 3 decades ago. But we did want to speak to the students and ask them their views, like, do they really want these OYO room kind of hostels now? Because we were told that that's what students want. They're paying so much money and that's what they deserve. Because apparently in ISB, that's the kind of housing they get. And that's the need of the hour, there's a demand of the students. So we did go and speak to more than 100 students. And first of all, we went to the dorm 15 and spoke to the students there, because that was the one dormitory which was completely renovated. And the students said that, actually we're really happy with the renovation. And of course, yes, we do have shared bathrooms, but they're good and we don't have any problem with that. And we're satisfied with the whole experience. So that was something very heartening. And I think 60% of the students said that, look, of course, yeah, maybe it might be nicer with attached bathrooms, but if you're saying that that's going to come at the cost of demolishing the entire old campus, then no, we don't want that. What they said was really, if I had to sum up like more than 100 responses, is that the work done by Louis Kahn is just amazing, and it's so unique and so important to IIM Ahmedabad. We should not demolish it. And all we are asking for is to give us some better facilities, like they wanted air conditioners. Now it is very possible to retrofit these dorms with air conditioning. In fact, dorm 15, when it was renovated, they did have a provision for adding an air conditioner. So all over the world, if you see, there are buildings which are 200, 300 years old, but they are upgraded, they are renovated, they have heating, they have modern plumbing. So it's not that it cannot be done. And that provision was also made in the dorm 15. So I think it's very wrong to say that students are demanding and therefore we are making this decision. As Meenakshi mentioned, students were not even consulted. Now, we also went and stayed in the new campus, dorm 33, for one day. And the difference was extremely stark. This was a view from my room. It just looks like Louis Kahn, but it's actually just superficial. There are a few round circles and a few bricks. But it doesn't have any of the thinking, any of the design philosophy of Louis Kahn. These rooms literally are OYO rooms. I was thinking that maybe if I were to join today, I could spend my entire 2 years in this room without meeting another person, because it has an attached bathroom. The classes are online, many of them, during COVID especially, and I can order food in my room. So what do I need to even go out for? So what is my experience of living in IIM Ahmedabad going to be? And when we spoke to students, they said that yes, they did find that there was very little interaction in these dormitories. Some of them didn't know their next door neighbors. I mean, this was just not possible in the old dorms. You had a lot of, your identity was linked with your dorm. Even today, people say, I'm from dorm 13, I'm from dorm 14, and we then find that kind of strong bonding with the dorms. I do agree that people say that times have changed, and so nowadays people are more online, they're chatting, and they're on text. But then as educators, our responsibility is to actually design spaces which create more interaction, because in the long run, apart to learn here and the degree you carry, it's the network and the bonding that you have with your fellow students which is the most important asset to gain from this 2-year experience at IIM Ahmedabad. So in the there's this passageway that links the old and new campus, and there's this very nice poster or some sort of a quote by Louis Kahn with his picture, which says that basically he wanted to create unity between the teaching building, dormitories, and teachers' houses. And, problem he gave himself to solve. But, it looks like this whole concept of unity doesn't seem to matter anymore to the, current dispensation. And then in that case, the only thing we're going to be left is these kind of posters, and instead of having living history, we're just going to have these memories on paper that there used to be the space and now it doesn't exist anymore, which would be a real shame. And we do think as alumni that where there is a will, there is a way, and Louis Kahn design campus should be restored as a whole, and that should be the goal, and not this piecemeal that we'll just keep the LK Plaza because that's good on convocation, or it would look bad to destroy the whole thing. Because once we do remove the dorms and put some other ugly structure there, which is most likely going to be like the Dom 33, it's going to have no unity. It's going to have no meaning. I mean, then they may as well just remove everything. And I think, again, I would say world over, Ivy League institutions have been able to preserve, restore, and repurpose old buildings, and they are integral to the brand value of those institutions. So maybe we could have, I mean, students could get options, like they could have an option to live in the heritage campus or in the new campus as per their preference. And we have certainly found that students who lived on heritage campus, even though initially they were not happy, but after a couple of months, they didn't want to shift, you know, they didn't want to shift out because they felt that there was something special here. So I hope that with all the efforts being made by the alumni, the architecture community, and other stakeholders, we are able to, preserve this legacy and maybe go back for our next reunion and visit our old rooms. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Rashmi. As I said, you stopped even before I could give you the 3-minute warning. So let me just make a few points, and then I'll open it up to the questions that some of the questions have started coming in.
Sorry, Prem, just let me interrupt you. Can I request all the presenters to kindly turn on their cameras, please?
The first point is that there is undoubtedly the presence of a legacy. And I mentioned in the beginning what is acknowledged on the IIM website. But the fact that the point that Rashmi made, that you feel like you're in the presence of something larger than life. And can we just override that? What happens, because we have this real problem of the structurally distressed masonry elements. So can we just so easily override that? And I think there's an important point made by Kiran over here when she said, do we confine our notion of heritage just to the Khan design campus, and what about the rest? So we actually here, very unusually for a heritage site, we have a living example of people who had worked with Khan and sought to sustain that legacy. You see an attempt to continue a spirit of that continue the same values that Khan was trying to instill in the campus design. So there's an attitude that has to be present. Even if we say the Khan campus is structurally distressed, how do we sustain that attitude? That becomes the important part. I think a second point I would like to just clarify, since the IIT Roorkee report was mentioned, is that it does not recommend demolition. It says that we need a new structural, and at least there are apparently 2 reports, out of which only 1 has been disclosed. But the one that has been disclosed says we need a new structural analysis that takes into account the distressed masonry elements, and then look at repair and strengthening as a way forward. So it has not explicitly recommended demolition. A third important point is that is the idea of which Meenakshi brought up, is heritage just a facade? Because that is what seems to be claimed in what the institution has been saying. First in 2020, they said we'll restore only Dom 16, 17, and 18, because that's the ones you see as soon as you come in, and we'll demolish the rest. And now they're saying that even the other classroom and faculty blocks will keep the external facade but change the inside. And this again is problematic because of 2 aspects. And I just like to quote a statement from something I wrote when the first 2020 announcement was made. And I said, Khan's design is more than a facade to be seen. It is embodied in a spatial order to be experienced, where the union of the academic block, library, and dormitories create an intimate network of courtyards that, along with the buildings, capture the spirit of a monastic community of learners where knowledge is collectively held as sacred. So I think those are aspects of aura we need to continue in our discussion. And this is not just tied to this fact that it's a spatial order, but also the point that Amit so wonderfully brought out is that there are other narratives that are embedded in it, which have to be read along with the spatial order and give a completely, very layered and complex sense of what heritage is. And the last point I'd like to mention is tied to a point Meenakshi raised, which was talking about maintenance. And there's a culture of maintenance. And it made me recollect the battle we had when we tried to save some aspects of Central Vista. And the justification for demolishing it was showing pictures of, the poor condition in which those old office buildings were. But they were in that poor condition just because of a certain culture of maintenance that had allowed to take root. And there was nothing to say that the new buildings that replaced it would also fall victim to that same culture of, I'd say, lack of maintenance rather than culture of maintenance. So that's a specific point that needs attention also. It's not just the culture of the original construction. It's not just the culture that inhabited the facility. It's also the culture of maintenance, of care that you sustain, that is living and continuous. And that's an important point that we need to bring in. So with that, I'll turn to some of the questions that have started coming in. And the first question from Poonam Verma is to Amit, where she says, what's the sense of engagement and shared memory, the shared legacy of NID with the IIMA today? And if I could add to that, I would ask, how do we bring all these narratives to life so that they live there along with the building?
Thanks, Prem, for the question. There's two things. Firstly, of course, I can't answer for today because my work was done a few years ago. But when I was doing the work, it was very sort of sad to see that there wasn't a deep understanding of how connected these narratives were. And weirdly enough, I was just talking to somebody and we were talking about a similar sort of stuff in writing the history of the NID building itself, which has amazing sort of, things that need to be talked about and they need to be maintained. And let's hope that that doesn't come under some sort of threat as well, and how intertwined these narratives are. So, and that's really why people don't know as much about the deep involvement of the NID as being the lead architect in that sort of sense and taking over the capacity for that. I remember when I was doing the research, I would go to IIM and I would say, where are the old archival drawings? And they said, well, we don't have it, that's with NID. And then I would go to NID and they'd say, well, we don't have it, that's with IIM. And it turned out that both of them had some stuff which was, in one case lying in old water tower and people didn't know where these things existed. But it's sad that there isn't really an understanding of how deeply these things were connected. So I think, yes, it's about setting those narratives out. And I think discussions like this, which take away the conversation on sort of saying, all right, we're just trying to preserve the physical aspects of a building in terms of its facade and trying to understand how interconnected it is to the history of the city. I think that's the way we can bring that forward. But yeah, unfortunately, as far as I know, currently there, or at least when I was there, there wasn't an interaction or acknowledgement of how deeply connected NID and IIM were as projects.
Another question being asked is, which arms of the government can we sort of engage with? Can we request INTAC, the Ministry of Higher Education, the Gujarat government? Should we be seeking to touch their minds and hearts and look into why we should allow such a valuable heritage asset to be expunged? So I think this is a question addressed to anyone who wishes to take it on.
So the Ministry of Higher Education and from the central government and a education secretary from the state government are both ex officio nominees on the governing council. So you would assume they are in the know and part of the discussions, but informally I came to know that the central government representative never attends the meetings. Because as far as they are concerned, I mean, between them, they have some 20 IITs and 20 IIMs, so they can't really keep track of them. They tend to go where their money is going So the IIMs and IITs that they're funding, they support, but they don't pay much attention to what's happening in IIMA. Informally, we heard that government of Gujarat, I mean, this is just informal, that people are not happy about the fact that these buildings are proposed to be demolished. But I had mentioned this issue of structural safety that proves to, keeps people at arm's length, and one official at the ministry actually was asking, are they crumbling? They actually had visions of buildings that are falling, and that's very, very far from the way it actually is. So there's no very good mechanism by which government can hold IIMA accountable. It's an autonomous institution, and that's good. But in this case, it is a concern that this could just happen without them looking at it, because actually it will shame India, not just IIMA and Ahmedabad, but also India, that such a thing was allowed to come to pass.
Okay, I'm going to slightly reframe another question that is asked, because the question refers to this place being something famous with architecture students the world over. And I remember when the Hall of Nations was at that time under threat of demolition, I got a call from Rohit Mendirata, who's the son of the structural designer Mahendra Raj, saying, can you collect data from local colleges in Bangalore as to whether this building is on the syllabus of architecture schools? Because apparently they had been legally advised that if this was done, then the argument could be made that it is a heritage asset in Is this something that could be tried with IIM Ahmedabad? Because this is unquestionably a building that is on the syllabi of architecture schools across the country and across the world, in fact.
I don't know. Can I say something from my own experience? I grew up in Delhi. I live in Chandigarh. And of course, there's a lot of talk about the IIMA, no doubt, as Louis Kahn's work, and most students know about it. But all that is said about it is largely, the way the buildings are interconnected, the architecture and the play of light, and the quality of spaces, and so on and so forth. If at all anything is mentioned about the material construction and all these experiments, which is such an important part of it, it is just one line somewhere. And it was only when Amit's thesis was pointed out to me, I think I had a PDF somewhere of the, before your book was published, which I can't repeat now. It was such a revelation to me. And that was the only reason why I wanted to go and look at it again. So what I'm saying is that even when we are teaching about the IIMA to architecture students, the way we project it is perhaps not good enough for people to understand the values. The teaching of history, whether ancient or modern or whatever, contemporary, is so much linked to the exercise of conservation today. So somewhere, when we are talking about education and all that unless the significance of the building is put forth in the syllabus. So, even when I looked at all the books, which talk about the building, somebody may say, okay, total area, it is the same story, which is repeated again and again, which of course, William Curtis, who's with us today, does it much better. They're not even well done, whatever is there.
I think the question here is not whether the subject is taught well in the architecture schools. The question is more a narrow legal one. The fact that because it exists on the syllabus of architecture history courses across the country and across the world, it should be recognized as a heritage asset. So it's just the mere recognition is enough, not how exactly it is taught. The wideness of the recognition. In the Hall of Nations case, that effort started, and before the day was done, the building unfortunately got demolished. So I'm just putting it on the table as a possible strategy.
I think if it's a legal strategy, that's worth trying. I don't really think that, I don't know, will it be swayed? I mean, I think they already recognize the heritage value of the heritage campus. Uh, I they may not all know, everyone in the governing council may not realize the extent to which architectural students study it and how widely it's discussed and how it forms part of the DNA of the community. Most alumni don't realize it. So it's something worth definitely publicizing. But whether it will sway the decision of IIMA one way or another is
doubtful.
Rashmi,
I don't think.
you talked about having
Yeah.
okay, let me just say something and then you can add whatever you have to say to what you together with the response to the question. You have talked about serving alumni and the difference in experience between the Khan dormitories and say the new dormitory that was built. What is happening amongst alumni to organize on this issue? You could throw some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, we have been making efforts for the last 2 years. We have sent several letters to the Board of Governors, to the director, putting forth all the findings, all the questions that we have. And some of us have also recently met the new director. So, I mean, there is, among the alumni, there is again this feeling that, well, if they are saying it's structurally weak, maybe it is, and, that's something we should not interfere with. But I think all that we are asking is that everything should be transparent. If we are taking a decision which is irrevocable, then it should be based on some very hard evidence which can be shared in black and white. I mean, these reports are not conclusive. Some of them have not been revealed. So the basis of the decisions is not clear. And we feel that as a management institute which teaches other people stakeholder management, governance, and, good principles of management, we should also, have the highest standards in these areas, which right now doesn't seem to be the case. So, and I would just want to add that actually currently in the new academic year, nobody is living, the entire dorms have been vacated. The old campus is vacant now because they built some new housing blocks. So now they don't need to use these anymore. So they have become a ghost, matlab, bhoot bangla type of place. So it's just paving the way for demolishing any day. We don't know which day that could happen. There's nobody living there anymore. They don't need those, the current students. And I mean, we are not sure when, maybe during the summer vacation it could happen. So, that's the status right now. I mean, we have made a lot of effort, but we are not really getting the desired response. We did also put forth a plan that, some of us maybe we can find a way to restore one dorm, and then that can be replicated, and we would raise the funding to do this, because we are sure that among the alumni and the wider community, people would come forward. But you see, as I said, where there's a will, there's a way. There should be, objective should be restoration and preservation. Then you can find a way to do it. If that's not your goal, then obviously you're not going to work hard for it. So.
Okay, Amit, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just want to add, so I understand that there's a sense of urgency right now, and I don't know if what I'm trying to say is going to address the sense of urgency clearly, but there's two things. One, I think when we talk about buildings, in a way, sort of it becomes like this sort of divide and conquer thing where, if you only talk about one building, then it becomes your job to try and sort of say, well, why is this building more important than other buildings? And I think the narrative needs to be about this interconnected thing, like we were talking about how IIM, NID, Sanskar Kendra, they're kind of part of a three-part sort of story that connects to what was happening at Ahmedabad at the time. And then presenting that as part of, even if it is to the local government or whatever, the idea that these three things then become part of an important narrative that tells us of a point of the becoming of Ahmedabad, which is the division of the Bombay state and the establishment of Gujarat and Maharashtra as separate states, and the role that Ahmedabad plays in it, and how these things are a specific part of that. I think creating that narrative, which is about, how that one building is part of a broader network of things, I think maybe has a better appeal, or at least from a politician's perspective or whatever, might have something that they can relate to in terms of connecting with the public. And the second thing was the bit that you were talking about, whether the building is taught about in schools around the world. And I think this is another thing. So if you take out aspects of the building, so Khan's idea of, the school, or the idea of, education under a tree and all that sort of stuff, then people sort of disassociate ideas from buildings. So for instance, the dialogue with the brick, that guaranteed is taught everywhere. It's in popular culture references, there are movies, where, people talk about that sort of stuff. So that's everywhere, and it's in popular culture. But if you connect it back, which it legitimately is connected to IIM, which is where the dialogue starts, then you can sort of really talk about it's not just architectural academic context. I can quote, movies where they use this reference of Louis Kahn talking to the brick as part of cultural knowledge. And the thing is that it's been disassociated from IIM because the dialogue has been taken by the world as something that Khan has done, but has not really been connected back to this experience in India. And if we connect it back, then of course we're claiming not only architectural academic context within students, but also popular culture, and which would make a much better case in trying to say what relevance this has for the world in total.
Meenakshi, you had raised your hand.
Well, I was just saying, as far as alumni are concerned, I think there is a lot of deep pain actually at the thought of demolishing the dormitories. At our recent reunion, people came back from their dorms, which have the old boards saying restoration and upgradation planned, and said, you know what, Meenakshi, our dorm is not going to be demolished. Ours is going to be restored and upgraded. And I said, no, those are old boards. Everything is going. And there's a deep connection. I think there is deep sadness, but they trust that nothing can be done about it. Otherwise, IIMA would not have taken this decision. And, some of them who may have feelings that this decision isn't a very good one may not be the types to raise their voices also and kind of challenge, the alma mater. But as Rashmi said, there is a group that is keen and continuing to ask questions whether there is a response or not. There is a response actually. Professor Errol always did speak to us when we went across. The recent directors also met us. But somehow the outcomes in terms of decision making have actually worsened. So from 2020 to 22, we made a lot of effort, and we had a worse outcome in 22 than 20. So in terms of results, we are not really getting much.
I mean, some people have brought up the question of the logo also changing, and I don't want to get into the details of that. But I think there's one aspect of that which maybe connects here is that normally a rebranding through a logo is preceded by a visioning exercise. And there was a lot of upset that people were very upset, especially many faculty I have heard, that visioning exercise did not occur before the rebranding was done, and the rebranding was not at all consultative. And that's the same thing that has happened with the building. There's been no visioning exercise in making these decisions. So one sort of wonders whether, this is supposed to be a premier institute that is #1 in the management institutions in the country. And if it makes this fundamental thing as an institution of management that rebranding is not preceded by visioning, is there a wider concern here for the institute as a whole that is beyond just the heritage question?
Yes, we are concerned about this because, as I said, if we teach management, we should be upholding the highest standards and principles. But again, I think our stand is that, the buildings are irreversible once they're gone, but logo could still be rolled back or whatever. So we have not focused so much on the logo aspect. But in fact, there is a archive section now in the Dorm 15 basement, which talks about how the original logo was developed over a period of 2 years. Several versions were made, different thoughts and different ideas were put forth. It wasn't just, off the top of somebody's head. So I think the same kind of thinking and process should be applied to any kind of change that is being made, whether it's in the syllabus, whether it's in the pedagogy. I mean, we have heard that case studies are not being used as much as before, especially in the first year, that less than 50%, or I think hardly 30-40% of the material is taught through cases now. Whereas when we studied that, it was entire, IIM Ahmedabad pedagogy rested on case methods. For every subject, we had cases, we had group discussions, we had class discussions. So we're a little concerned that a lot of things that were the hallmark of IIM Ahmedabad, which defined our institution, are being eroded. And without any discussion or thought. I mean, if someone says that, look, okay, this is the new vision, but we don't know what the new vision is. So I agree with you. It's a matter of concern. And this, in fact, is so the buildings is one symptom of this whole lack of vision and purpose, which seems to be there at present.
There are concerns being raised on various issues like fees, hiking of fees. There was a huge discussion. There was a question in Parliament as well. So basically, I had that governance slide just to illustrate that the governing council is all nominated people. They're not really representing constituencies. And as far as the Act is concerned, they don't have to represent or have a two-way communication with any of the constituencies, be they the alumni or industry or any. So it's really up to the IIMs how they take the process forward. Some IIMs have actually explicitly said on their website that they would like these nominees to play a two-way role and ensure participation of wider constituencies into the decision of the governing council. But perhaps for some reason IIMA hasn't gone that way. But it would be a concern if such decisions were being, because we focused only on the dorms, then we heard about the logo. We haven't really gone into the decision making on a wider range of issues at IIM, and actually that's not our purpose, because that would make the mandate a bit it's already unmanageable. So
apologies, we are kind of running out of time.
Yeah.
Prem, would you please wrap up the session?
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think it's been a rich session, and I said it needs to actually set the tone for this whole webinar, and not just the webinar, but action to follow. And I think we've got a wonderful set of narratives, the broad perspective on the campus as a whole, beyond just the Khan design campus, the underlying narratives that went into making it, and the sort of layering of what heritage really is. And we've got the perspectives of what it is to actually inhabit the campus, and that's really a wonderful range of issues. And I look forward to how this feeds into and sets the tone for the discussions to follow. So I thank all the speakers, the organizers, and look forward to further discussion.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We will now begin with session 2. Nigar.
Hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Yeah. So after an enriching session 1, we move forward to the second technical session, which is managing Louis Khan's legacy. I'm Nigar Sheikh. I'm session anchor for today's second technical session. I'm a conservation engineer at Center for Heritage Conservation, CEPT University, and EPWG West Zone representative of ICOMOS India. The chair and discussant for this session is Suzanne McDonald, and we have 4 speakers in this particular session. Suzanne McDonald is the head and building sites at Getty Conservation Institute, Vice President of ICOMOS 20th Century Committee. The first speaker is Peter Inskip. He is the director at Inskip G Architects, trustee at Docomomo, UK. Followed by David Feixler, architect, author, principal of DF Architecture, Planning, Preservation, and lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. The third speaker, we have Sarah Ladinois with us, architect, project specialist, Getty Conservation Institute at USA.
And the last speaker for session, we have Alexandra Rampezzo, architect, founder partner, AMAA Collaborative Architecture Office, Italy. We look forward to, again, a very engaging session. Over to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigar, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you very much for a wonderful first session. I learned so much. It was terrific. And so welcome to session 2, Managing Khan's Legacy. The current threats to the campus of IIM as one of Khan's most complete works and the collective work of Indian architects, engineers, and patrons is as a cultural landscape, and also the threats to a number of significant buildings are similar to the threats facing many sites of the modern era. And these include lack of appreciation and protection, particularly for modern university campi. And as we heard, despite its international significance, it's actually not protected. Challenges related to material and technical innovation and realization, in this case, the innovative use of reinforced and unreinforced brick, material degradation relating to inherent characteristics of the predominant materials, poor past repairs, lack of maintenance. Challenges relating to the need to accommodate growth to meet increased activity and use of the site. Challenges relating to the adaptation for contemporary standards of accommodation and educational needs. Challenges relating to the need to meet current building codes relating to structure, seismic, accessibility, environmental, and so on. And in addition here, this lack of holistic site management planning approach for the whole campus, the new and the old, on the basis of good conservation plan has been a major factor. This sort of missed opportunity that the 25-year master plan had is lamentable and set the scene for this rather reactive planning that's brought things to this current situation, reducing the campus to this remnant core of original buildings and destroying the overall significance of the site. So what we're really facing here is a conflation of technical and planning issues. However, none of these challenges are new. We have nearly 50 years of practice in managing change to modern heritage sites and how these myriad of challenges can actually be met. There's nearly always a solution, and ultimately the inability to address them comes down to expertise, money, approach, or will, or any of a combination of those things. Sustainable development drivers and the demand for construction to move towards carbon neutrality is highlighting the irresponsibility of unnecessary demolition and the need to consider adaptation first. Cost is now calculated in terms of carbon and dollar costs. So conservation is about managing change to the places that we value so that they can continue to be vibrant places that meet future and contemporary needs. And Khan's great works of international standing represents many of the challenges that we face when we're dealing with conserving modern architecture. And what this session will do is focus specifically on how these challenges have been successfully addressed by applying established and sound conservation approaches on 3 case studies of Khan buildings. And they demonstrate how this holistic conservation planning, good diagnostic and technical investigation, coupled with sound understanding of all the tangible and intangible values, can lead to solving difficult challenges relating to seemingly irreconcilable technical adaptability and philosophical challenges. We'll also learn about Khan's reinforced masonry system employed here on some of the buildings, because it's the use of this system and the choice of materials that has created some difficult technical problems, which has proved the tipping point in arguments for demolition of the dormitory buildings. And a clear understanding of this method is actually really helpful for our considerations today. So let's dive in. Let's look at examples of how good practice, collective interdisciplinary expertise, and creative minds have solved seemingly unsolvable problems. I'm going to remind the speakers to keep to time. You will be getting a 3-minute warning from me. And I will now invite Peter Inskip to present the work at the Yale Centre for British Art. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. It's been a great pleasure to work on quite a number of buildings, and also one had the marvelous thing of when I was an architecture student, Khan used to come to Cambridge and for a week each year and teach us. So one heard a lot of that sort of poetry that he talked about, rather than just going straight in. So what we have got is, I think, talk.
I'm sorry, can I just remind everyone to mute their speakers, please, and just leave the speaker's mic on?
And we've done a talk which, for simplicity, we thought we'd record. So let's play that. It's great.
Hi, Nigar.
Yes. Yes, we can see. Yeah.
Let's
play it.
go. Conservation plan is a marvelously simple idea. A thorough understanding of place facilitates the development of a statement of significance, where that significance is vulnerable is identified and conservation policies defined to protect the significance from those vulnerabilities. It was a system devised by James Semple Kerr, and his study of the Sydney Opera House remains the model for conservation plans. We were commissioned to prepare a plan for the Yale Centre of British Art at New Haven in Connecticut. It was Khan's last art gallery, and he died on the way back from India in 1974, prior to its completion. It employs quite a different architectural vocabulary from his previous works, a frame infilled with steel panels and flush glazing, rather than mass with deep voids and openings. Like many of Khan's projects, the client figure was all important. Jonas Salk at the Salk Institute, Dr. Paul at IIMA, and in this case it was Jules Prown, a professor in the History of Art department, who guided the selection of the architect and took the project through to completion of the building while he's acting as its first director. The collection of British art and the building that was to house it were the gift to his old university of the banker, philanthropist and Anglophile Paul Mellon. Mellon's architect of choice was I.M. Pei, who had built the East Wing of the National Gallery for his family. However, Prown was convinced that Khan was the ideal architect for the project. He had taught at Yale and had also built the University Art Gallery in the 1950s with its diagrid ceiling, allowing distribution of mechanical services as well as the placement of pogos. The core of the collection was housed in Mr. Mellon's house in Virginia and hung in a very domestic manner. Khan visited the house and found that patron and architect were both bibliophiles. He carefully waxed lyrical about the English country house with paintings hanging in great halls and long galleries. Rather than showing Mellon the University Art Gallery, Prown flew with the donor to California and met Khan at the Salk. There was nothing relevant to see inside the building, but the plaza and its views over the Pacific Ocean secured Khan the commission. The initial scheme was for the development of one side of the city block, except for a redundant church which stood at one corner. Khan felt that the church looked like a dumb elephant and longed to incorporate it. In line with the city planning requirements, the ground floor street frontage had to be given over to commercial properties, and portals led to the inner core, from which one rose to the galleries and library space on the floors above. However, it was too ambitious, and Mr. Mellon's lawyer was clear that it was beyond the available resources. The revised project was more modest and pulled back the building, disengaging the church with a new external lower court.
The building was structured around 2 courts, set deep in the plan. The portico cut through the commercial band that faced the streets, opening to the quadruple height entrance court. Steel panels demarcate the rear of the outward-facing shops. Oak millwork screens house the 3 floors of galleries above, and openings allow views onto those exhibition spaces. The library court rises from the 2nd floor, its blind millwork walls screening the study rooms and rare book libraries, but opening on the top floor to the top-lit galleries that extend over the whole of the 4th floor. The hanging of the 2 large paintings by Stubbs is suggested in some of Khan's sketches, but generally paintings were not destined to be site-specific. The approach, however, was definitely sympathetic to Mellon's idea of the English country house. In the galleries, materials are all neutral. Poured concrete, travertine, oak millwork, Hessian, and natural wall carpets. Views over the entrance court to other galleries located the visitor within the building and countered museum fatigue. The double height study rooms and libraries were clearly expressed, with their clearly expressed mechanical systems followed the same pattern, giving simplicity as well as richness to the building. Views out to the street located you within the city. The space between the church and the reduced building of the 2nd project was treated by Khan as the lower court. It provided a 2nd entrance to the auditorium and opened to the restaurants on 2 sides. Its monumental treatment, almost as a ruin, underlined that the court was part of the centre, and possibly Khan's gesture towards precluding later development on that side. Whilst conservation plans are concerned with significance, physical condition cannot be ignored. In contrast to projects in India, the centre was constructed by one of the great construction companies of America. But of course, there were still building defects. The monumental stair down to the lower court was found to be moving due to the failure of its reinforcement, and it had to be rebuilt on a new slab. Similarly, penetration of water through the external envelope had corroded fixings, and moisture was entering the galleries. These had to be stripped out and repaired to eliminate the problem. After 30 years, some upgrades to meet current building codes were certainly needed for fire safety requirements and improving attitudes to accessibility. The access to the auditorium was indeed a nightmare, without any handrails to the steeply raking steps, and people with disabilities had to go through back-of-house areas, and there was no accommodation for carers. But there was also what the staff at the centre identified as drift, and by that one means drift away from Khan's late architectural philosophy. Small changes, but accumulatively they were having a big impact on the cultural significance of the building. The galleries had been very carefully designed by Khan, and details such as daylighting had been developed on the basis of the full-size mock-ups off-site, but using works of art from the collection. Both Khan and Mellon believed in experiencing paintings in changing daylight conditions, and for the donor that represented an important element of the domesticity of the installation. Lighting cassettes shades on the roof, and sliding screens modulated light for the conservation of the paintings, but preserving the variation of conditions in which pictures were viewed was all important. Whilst pictures were to be experienced in room-like spaces, a room was not a room in Kahn's terms unless there was daylight, and continuity of space was achieved with the use of pogos. J.M.W. Turner's great painting, The Dort, was the centrepiece of an exhibition at the Royal Academy in London to mark the centenary of Paul Milne's birth. And it was received with great acclaim. But the painting was something quite different when seen within the gallery designed by Kahn. The changing light, the natural materials, the calm of the setting, and the relationship to the window with its view out over the city. Over the years, there had been attempts to improve the galleries, particularly with temporary exhibitions. Blue damask was introduced as a background for some 18th century portraits. Walls extending the full width of the bay replaced the use of pogos in some exhibitions, and experiments in artificial lighting using small apologetic fittings replaced the larger downlighter cans that Kahn considered integral to the building. Serious drift also occurred with closing off the views into the galleries from the entrance court. The openings were treated from the court as if the blinds had been drawn down and closed within the galleries with sheetrock panels to gain additional display space, losing a terribly important idea of this expansion of space and being able to see your destination when you came into the hall. At another level, the study gallery, that was intended to extend as one open space along the whole of the north side of the fourth floor, was divided into individual bays. It has now been restored and forms the long gallery that Kahn had intended. Outside, the opportunistic colonization of the lower court by the restaurants rendered Kahn's space architecturally meaningless for a number of years until the trellises and pergolas and this portico canopy were cleared away. Looking forward, like any successful gallery, there's also a perceived need for more space. Possibly an additional gallery could be accommodated beneath the parking lot, and access would indeed be possible from the central stair core of Kahn's building. But very careful consideration would be necessary to accommodate it within the architectural philosophy to which the rest of the building responds so rigorously following its, especially now, following its recent renovation. Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Can I just ask people, if you start to have questions, if you would like to start dropping them in the chat for the discussion at the end. Can I now invite, please, David Fixler to talk about repurposing Richard's Medical Research Laboratories. Peter, it's David, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to try sharing my screen. Hopefully this will work. Hang on just a moment, please. There it is.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I shall begin. Thank you, Susan. This talk is about the transformation of one of Kahn's first and most iconic buildings, the Richards Laboratories at the University of Pennsylvania, which was designed after the Yale Art Gallery, but before the buildings in India and before the Salk. This actually was Kahn's first laboratory building. And it is a building where, I will move right into this. It's a building where there was a fundamental disconnect at some level between Kahn's notion of what a scientific laboratory was and what the and how the scientists really work. There was this sort of tragic lack of dialogue in that early design process, which led to this disconnect. So Kahn designed this wonderful building with this quote up here on the left: "No space you can devise satisfy these requirements. Thought what they should have is a corner for thought. In a word, is studio instead of slices of space." So he envisioned these towers, which you can see in this wonderful photo on the left, before all of the laboratory fit out was put in, of the basic building, the brick towers, the brick service towers as the servant space, and then the glazed laboratory towers as the serve space. Probably in some ways one of the most poetic manifestations of this this fundamental part of Kahn's philosophy. But even Vincent Scully, the architectural historian, who was a great supporter of Kahn and called this one of the great buildings of the 20th century, said, in a material sense, they function not perfectly at all. And I say all this, and if you look at, just to sort of orient you, the C in the plan on the right is a brick service tower. So that's largely blank. It is reinforced concrete with a brick skin. The A, B, and D towers are the glazed laboratory towers. The two towers off to the right are the Goddard laboratories, which were not part of the project that we were involved in. So I'm not going to talk about those. So here is the disconnect writ large. You have Louis Kahn at a special show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961, celebrating this building. It was a show devoted entirely to this work. And then on the right, the sort of haphazard way in which the laboratories were occupied from the beginning, with services breaking all kinds of rules about how the services should be run within the building. And one of the things that was fundamental to us was really, of course, going back through the archives, figuring out Kahn's original notion for the building, and very important to sort of discover how, in fact, these laboratories were meant to function from the standpoint of the design of the building. So it's also important to note that this is Kahn's first encounter with structural engineer August Commandant, with whom he subsequently did most of his work. And Commandant designed this concrete frame structure, which you see this sort of tic-tac-toe grid, with these cantilevered glazed corners, and they're all done with pre-stressed, precast concrete. And you see on the right, basically a reflected ceiling plan, which shows you the ideal of this architecture and how it was meant to be read. And then on the lower left, you see the reality of the labs that had to be put in. So all these are part of the original working drawings. It's not as though these were things that were done after the fact. However, if you look again at the three glazed towers, this was never something that really jived entirely with Kahn's vision as to how the lab should work. And frankly, it never worked terribly well for the scientists themselves. So here is a series of diagrams that show how, in fact, these services were run. He was very, very concerned and did these very poetic sketches, which I don't unfortunately have time to show, about how the HVAC systems would gang together and sort of create the lungs that enabled this laboratory building to breathe. He took that very literally. But what he did do was go through on the drawings and identify each of these services, which you see on the drawing on the right, and how they stack one above the other within the Virandil frame system that holds the building together. The idea that the Virandil frames, this is the second time he's used it, but it's the first time he's using it with Commandant, accommodate the services running above this 8'6" plane of the bottom of the structure. And it's very important to recognize from, you can see it from this photo, you can see the large windows in the distance and in the corner to the left. And there is what we came to call the sacred space between the window sill and the head, so that all of the services either feed down and stop at the trusses, or they feed up and stop at a level below that datum for where the window is, so that you get this clear space when it is possible. So here were the programmatic and technical building challenges that we were faced with. Durability of the exterior was of premier importance, primarily of the glazing systems, the outdated services, and then a fundamental disconnect and misunderstanding of the logic of the original services design and the random changes, the natural accessibility and code upgrades, and again, for the program disconnects, and some conservation problems with the concrete and CMU, et cetera. So the photo on the left just gives you an idea as to how these laboratories evolved in an ad hoc fashion over the years, and in a way that really, in many cases, fought with the building rather than try to accommodate it. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about the glazing. These are quite monumental lights. They're 14.5 feet wide by 5.5 feet tall. And they were just 1/4-inch plate glass, which is a beautiful material, but one which no longer meets any kind of wind or seismic code and presents a major safety hazard, as well as being very energy inefficient. However, he did devise this gorgeous stainless steel frame, this very, very elegant stainless steel framing system, which we did a lot of research on, and actually is the second generation of a continuous evolution that Khan explores with the idea of bent stainless steel plate right up to the Yale Art Gallery that Peter just showed you his wonderful presentation on. It was very much present in that. It's in Kimball, it's in Exeter, it's in most of the buildings he did in America. So in order to try to both improve the energy performance of this, because it's important to understand that this is a project that was funded by the university through basically an energy improvement fund. So we had to make every effort we possibly could to make the building more sustainable. Now, so what we came to for the glass was to use a high performance laminated glass. It's still monolithic in that there is no gap. And the laminated glass enables you to provide safety, a little bit better energy performance, and very important though, however, with lights of this size, it enables the flatness that is so much a character defining feature of this glass and of the exterior of the building. Then we got very aggressive with the HVAC system and introduced a chill beam system. It's the first time they used it at the University of Pennsylvania, which was much more energy efficient than the traditional variable air volume system that one might normally have used. And the reason we could do this in many ways was A, because we are tightening up the exterior of the envelope, but B, because we are transforming the building now from a wet laboratory to a center for cognitive neurosciences, which is very computer intensive, but not air intensive. So we could use a much more, the amount of air change required could be accommodated by a chill beam system, which normally is a tough thing to use in a laboratory. So with that, we first of all, looking at the image on the upper left, that's the mock-up of the glass in place, and the gentleman gesticulating in the middle there is the glazing contractor, who was one of the heroes of this project. I mean, talking about recognizing that the constructors of these buildings, he's someone who was able to, because the building had moved over the years, the concrete had settled somewhat, the brick knee walls had bowed out slightly. And so none of the replacement glass panels were perfect rectangles. They all had to be laser measured and sort of custom cut to fit within each opening. And that was accomplished with great aplomb. And then, of course, this you get a sense on the lower left of these services running above in a more organized fashion, in a fashion where the lighting is back to the original scheme, which had been, for the most part, throughout the building, moved to different areas. We put them back online, and that is a typical now corner office. And here you see on the left, the comparison, lower left, of Kahn's original glazing detail and the glazing detail which we implemented. You see it's a subtle difference. The glass is thicker, of course it's heavier. We now had to use a structural silicon system, and the stop, which we identified as a character defining feature, is no longer purely functional. It is something that simply covers the joint but has no structural capability anymore. This is now a structurally glazed system. And then on the right, this is a page from the conservation and maintenance guidelines that we provided the university as part of the package of services that we gave to them. And it reinforces this notion that Kahn had drawn about where each service should go, how it should be fed, and what to do in the event of having to do changes.
3 minutes, David.
Thank you. In order to make this work, we had to more evenly distribute, more equitably distribute the office space. And we identified a system whereby Kahn had really figured out a way to move off-grid where necessary in order to locate partitions in the most optimal place. And what you see here is you can see the blue as being the original grid lines where you would normally put the partitions. Now we have pushed these lines back, provided infill at the ceiling, which I will show you in the next slide, and been able to move here these partition over in order to give equal space to the corner office and the office next door. And this was not negotiable with the university. They said we absolutely have to meet these standards. But by pushing these lines down, we have created an open space big enough to accommodate graduate student workstations and really make this function. Another piece that we felt was absolutely critical was that one corner remain open in any of these floors so that when you come into the suite, you get the sense of the expanse of the space that Kahn originally wanted. And here you see how we made this all work in terms of the distribution of services. The little detail on the left is the off-grid offset panel design that Kahn utilized initially just in storage areas, but we made it part of the greater scheme. We looked to Kahn himself for the idea also of moving partitions off-grid. You can see on the right there at the Kimball Art Museum, but also thinking about what kind of a palette we wanted to use for our new interior insertions, looking at buildings like the Yale Center for British Art. And this is, of course, an image that Peter just showed. It comes from his conservation plan. So here are the pieces in place. And you can see right along this line here, that is these infill panels with the walls cut back. This is the interior detail between the two offices so that you have an acoustic separation, but the light from the big window can come into the inner office. We did a light touch conserving the concrete except where the paint had to be stripped, and now there is this wonderful luminous quality about it. And we also introduced this shroud. It created really a found space that used to be storage at the entrance to a more gracious entrance to each laboratory suite, providing extra meeting or lounge area. And this idea of the shroud concealing the systems was another sketch idea that Kahn had proposed for the building that was never executed, that we adapted and turned into something contemporary to house lights and control a riot of systems that run above that. Here are the views from one tower to the next. Again, this idea of the expansion of space and being able to see from one tower and the next was something that was never realized in the original scheme, but now with the repurposing of the program, we were able to do that. Again, light touches in these areas like around the entry and the transitions. And here is the space now fully furnished. And so with that, I wrote up a little piece on adaptability and transformation, because this is a case where if we had tried to be too literal about use value, the building was stuck. I mean, there were people who called this building the worst laboratory ever designed, and it really never met its original goal. But since it has become the Center for Cognitive Neurosciences, this opened about 6 or 7 years ago, to all we hear, it's been working very well, and we have finally found a proper accommodation between, in this case, Kahn's original idea, the heritage fabric of the exterior of the building and the concrete, and a workable program to carry this building forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Can I now ask Sarah Ladnois to join us to present the Salk Institute for Biological Studies Conserving the Teak Window Wall Systems. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. And I think our colleagues in India were actually going to share my slides for me. Is that still the case?
Yeah, Nigar.
Okay. Okay. Great. We can go to the second slide right away. Okay, so thanks again, Susan. Oh, actually, yeah, presentation overview. Okay, thanks again, Susan. So today I'm going to speak to you about how another Kahn design site, the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and its teak window walls presented a challenge to them 50 years after construction. And they originally thought that they would have to do complete demolition and replacement of the assemblies. However, through a collaborative project, the Getty Conservation Institute and the Salk Institute, we developed a conservation-based approach involving a multidisciplinary team that resulted in 2/3 of the original window walls and teak being conserved in place. So next. So briefly, next slide. Briefly, the Salk Institute was founded by Dr. Jonas Salk, the developer of the first successful polio vaccine. Salk commissioned Kahn to design a campus for his new scientific research institute on a Southern California bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The lab building, completed in 1965, consists of 2 nearly identical wings of laboratory space, freestanding study towers, and office space at the west end of the site, each mirroring the other on either side of a paved central plaza. Next slide. So as we mentioned, one of the major elements of the site are the 203 teak window wall assemblies, which are set within the concrete walls of the study towers and office wings. They are prefabricated assemblies consisting of teak frames, sliding window louver and shutter sashes, and vertical siding, which covers the pockets into which all of these sashes retract. At the interior, the assemblies are clad in oak paneling. Next slide. So teak was very specifically chosen because it was thought to be a durable, maintenance-free material requiring no surface treatments, and that in its anticipated gray weathered state, it would be compatible with the adjacent concrete. However, as you can see in these photos, the exposed marine environment did not allow for this. And after 50 years, the windows had deteriorated, weathered, and were in need of repair. These photos illustrate some of the conditions across the site, which included weathering that varied by exposure, a black fungus on the wood that had troubled the Institute from the late 1960s onwards, the remains of later surface coatings that were applied with the intent of protecting the wood, but also turned it bright red, altering its relationship to the adjacent concrete, and water and termite damage that led to some of the siding panels actually falling out of place, as you can see in the lower right image. So due to these conditions, Salk had originally assumed total replacement was necessary, but they also realized that a project could jeopardize the site's architectural significance, and would also raise questions about the consumption of a rare natural resource, the Southeast Asian teak. Next slide. So in 2013, a collaborative SALC, Getty Conservation Institute project was developed to see if there was an alternative approach that would better protect the site's significance. The objectives of the project were to address the immediate need to fix the deteriorating window walls and to develop a conservation-based approach for the long-term care of the window walls that could also be applied to other site components in the future. The project was divided into 4 phases. The first involved historical research and assessment of significance, condition assessments, scientific research and diagnoses, and development of conservation policies and preliminary treatment recommendations. In the second phase, the GCI, along with the architectural and engineering firm Wisciani Elsner Associates, which served as the historic preservation consultant to the Salk Institute, developed a series of on-site trial mock-ups to evaluate different repair approaches and treatments to identify the most appropriate ways to move forward. So next slide, please. Drawing upon the results of the GCI's earlier research and the trial mock-ups, WJE fully developed the conservation treatment of the window walls and prepared construction documents, including detailed drawings and specifications in phase 3. And this was all the basis of the 4th phase of work, the implementation or construction phase. I will say that this entire process, while new to Salk, was immediately familiar to them because it echoes the scientific research processes which take place within their own laboratories, particularly the trial mock-ups being equated to trials you might do for medical development of cures for medical issues. So I will now share with you some of the work and findings of the first 2 phases of work. Next slide. So while we understood the overall significance of the site, we wanted to look specifically at the significance of the window walls within the context of the larger site. You can see here we have a summary of that assessment, and I wanted to call your attention to some of the key points. And one was that we found the prefabricated window walls to demonstrate a unique synthesis of industry and craft, combining both traditional and modern materials and techniques. And then the last point here is that these windows are also examples of custom exterior millwork used in Kahn's larger body of work. There are many similarities in use and detailing to residential projects, such as the Corman House and Fisher Houses and the library at Phillips Exeter Academy. And in fact, we found out that these sites are also experiencing, you can go back one more to that previous slide. And in fact, we found out that these sites are also experiencing some of the same challenges related to the detailing of the millwork. And an important thing that happened during the project is we worked with Bill Whitaker at the Architectural Archives at Penn to organize a meeting with the owners, stewards, and conservation teams involved in these other sites. And it was a great opportunity to share information and to learn about how others were responding to their specific challenges, and if there are lessons that we could learn from them that could be incorporated into our own work, and that hopefully they would learn something from what we shared at the Salk. So next slide. I would say that these assemblies are incredibly complex with a number of different elements in them, and all of these different elements make different relative contributions to the overall significance of the assembly. So we set about assessing and grading the different elements of the assemblies, as one would do for a historic site as a whole, to help us understand which are essential to retain and which may be altered or removed if necessary. We found that elements such as the overall prefabricated nature of the assembly and the teak cladding and window sashes were of exceptional significance, while interior stock components such as the wood stud framing were of moderate significance. Other elements, such as later surface coatings, were found to be intrusive and detracting from the overall significance. This whole exercise also addressed other aspects that needed to be factored into the decision-making process, such as code and owner requirements and the treatment of hazardous materials, such as transite panels, that were in the interior of the wall assemblies. Next slide. So as part of the preliminary condition assessment, we also opened up two of the window walls to better understand how the walls were assembled and attached to the concrete structure, and also look at the condition of the internal elements. In the process, we found that the flashings shown on the original design drawings and shop drawings were in fact not installed. And we also found significant moisture and termite damage to the internal softwood framing in some locations. Next slide. We also spend a lot of time looking at the wood with a wood scientist consultant. We wanted to be sure that we did in fact have teak, because there are a number of other tropical hardwoods that are commonly referred to as teak, and we wanted to understand the characteristics of it so that that might inform appropriate treatment and specifications for compatible replacement materials where needed. The analysis showed that the weathering of the wood varied significantly depending on exposure, but that there was in fact quite a lot of good wood in existing wood in good condition that could be conserved in place. We also undertook scientific analyses to understand the nature of past surface treatments and also what this troubling black fungus was. It turns out that it likely comes from the surrounding eucalyptus trees and thrives where there is a moisture source. It is not a decay fungus, but more of an aesthetic issue. It is part of the environment in La Jolla, so it's not possible to prevent its growth, but in future phases of the work, we would look at how we might be able to retard its growth by limiting access to moisture or using fungicides. Next slide. Finally, I just wanted to point out that during this first phase, we identified a number of design deficiencies or modifications that impacted performance. For example, on the left, we have some drawings showing the horizontal drip edges, which at some point, the projection of which was reduced during construction, which meant they eroded away more quickly, allowing space for water and air to get into the wall cavities. So this is in the future, we looked at what would be the right balance about maybe adding more of a projection where these needed to be replaced for longer term durability and performance. And as I mentioned on the right, this issue of the missing flashing, which left the sealants to do the whole job of closing the joints at the perimeter where the teak met the concrete. So next slide. So we developed a set of conservation principles to guide the development of the design response that were based on all of this work in phase one. It was important that you'll see in our conservation principles that it was important that these museums would not just be considered museum showpieces, but that they had to be functional and safe, keeping the weather out and providing an appropriate work environment for the scientists so they could continue to carry out their work. Next slide. So these principles guided the development of 3 general treatment typologies to respond to the range of conditions on the site, from minor to major interventions, and that all levels of intervention included cleaning, removal of past surface treatments, and preventive treatments to control termites. These mock-ups helped us better understand which treatments worked, which did not, from an aesthetic, a technical, and logistical point of view, and how the solutions will perform in the short, medium, and long term, and also how well they were able to adhere to the conservation principles.
3 minutes, Sarah.
Okay, great. Next slide. And so some of the key technical challenges that we also looked to develop solutions to during the mock-up phase were, as I previously mentioned, the feasibility of installing flashing and weather barriers where possible to improve performance. Options for sourcing teak where we would need replacement material, including reclaimed and new teak. And options for addressing the fungal biofilm growth, such as modifications to the wood detailing to reduce moisture uptake and application of water repellents and fungicides. And these all informed the refinement of the treatment options in the design and construction phases. So next slide. So at the end of the design and construction phase, I'm happy to report that 2/3 of the original teak was able to be conserved in place, which is a far different outcome than the total replacement planned for the site. And that the Salk's facility manager, who managed the work and also its ongoing maintenance, estimates that the expected lifespan of these renewed assemblies is 50 to 70 years. He also has said that the methodology provided to him, which is very logical and transparent, has really given him a good tool for explaining the decision-making process to Salk leadership and other interested stakeholders. And the last slide, please. And we are also quite pleased that this methodology has since been applied to other projects on the site. During the teak work, the Salk decided to take advantage of the elaborate scaffolding system in place and to address some of the more urgent concrete repairs. And this was a project that was led by their architectural consultant, Wisjani. And so there is one more slide that just has some sources for additional information about the project. And I'd like to say thanks to all for listening.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm now going to invite last speaker from this session, Alessandra Rampazzo, to talk about her work on Steel Like Straw, Lewis Kahn and IIM Ahmedabad, and in relation to the materials. Thank you, Alessandra.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and thank you all, especially for inviting me and offering me the opportunity of being part of this huge open platform of discussion on the future of modern past. So let me share my screen. Full screen?
Yes, we do now.
Right?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, it's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So let's move directly to the main focus of my intervention, which actually goes back to the IIMA and its narratives, as we also heard before. So as we have already gone through it, the actual conditions of the buildings of the Indian Institute of Management raise questions on responsibilities for design and technical choices that were taken during the construction phase. Actually, this is important in order to define priorities on conservation. We should then take a step back and deeply look into the entire process. That was actually the starting point of my research for the PhD back in 2015. But let's jump quickly to the narration of the events. And I'm actually sorry if I need to repeat things that I have already heard about, especially after the great presentation of Amit in session 1. That was actually a very important source for my research as well. But as we all know, in the aftermath of India's independence conquered in 1947, the important families related to the textile industries, thanks also to their connection with the United States, brought to the Gujarati city of Ahmedabad significant cultural and educational institutions, born as part of a broader program of economic, political, and cultural reorganization promoted by Nehru, the Prime Minister of the new India. This general approach, which bonded the central state, but also the other protagonists of the state of Gujarat, the Ford Foundation, and the Sarabhais and Lalbhais families, played an important role in the process of founding the National Institute of Design, the NID, that came first in 1961, followed the year after by the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, inspired by the organization of the American Harvard Business School. All these things together ensure the involvement of the NID, as we heard before, established with the specific aim of training local architects through the collaboration of international professionals in the design of the Institute of the Management. Finally, guided by Balkrishna Joshi in 1962, Gautam Sarabhai, that was the president of the newly born NID, asked Kahn to participate as a consultant teacher in the project for the IIMA. which meant to provide a useful learning opportunity, not only in theory, but in practice for the Institute staff. The expected duration of 3 years would include 3 or 4 site visits for Khan in Ahmedabad, while the drawings were supposed to be made exclusively in Ahmedabad by the architects of the NID. On Khan's side, this particular collaboration was so unusual to the point that he perceived it as a limit to his possibilities when compared to the working method already tested in Philadelphia office for the other assignments he was dealing with at the same time. The control during the construction phase, in fact, has always been decisive for reaching the same order that lays as the base of his architectural research. Considering this, Khan suggested some changes in order to carry out his service as architect in the best possible way. He then stressed the importance of his constant involvement during the entire design and building process, which was then marked by daily transmission of information for years using the means available at that time, which were letters, telegrams, annotated drawings, and more rarely, phone calls. He had really to set up a specific method for the development of the project. The result was the conception of an identifying image of the campus achieved through homogeneous masses of bricks, interrupted only by the concrete use for few horizontal elements, such as chain beams and slabs, and for the staircases. Despite obvious complications and delays, due to the complications of connection and transmitting information, the construction finally started in October 1964, choosing 2 buildings, 1 student dorms, the D12, and 1 staff house, the Residence 501, as samples. But December 1964, so few months after the beginning, was Khan's first visit on site. That moment represented a fundamental step for the future development of the construction, and more generally speaking, of the entire project. Crucial decisions were taken during that visit, a real turning point in the design process aimed at bringing together the theoretical assumptions with the practical aspects of a construction, especially if we consider it was managed from a distance. The solution appeared to be found with the construction of the sample yard. That was not actually just an experimental arch. It was a sample yard, a sort of explanatory model of each part of the campus. What was established in its construction had to be followed in detail on site during the next stages. What was important, what actually is important to stress here, is that the choice of a module and material and of the way of using it led to a vocabulary that was decisive for the identity and the image of the campus that everybody knows today. I'm quoting, "Design demands that one understands the order," explained Khan. "When you're dealing or designing in brick, you must ask brick what it wants or what it can do." The experience of the sample yard was indeed a turning point in the design technique of the entire project. The dimensional data of the elements of the project in their most traditional form of proportions disappeared from drawings in favor of the indication of the number of courses or modular elements, the brick, and their exact position in the configuration. That was absolutely a strategy, an operative strategy set up by Khan. And that confirmed his complete involvement in the project and consequently his awareness on the decision taken on site. The construction then continued following the indication received during that December 1964 until 1969, already 6 years after making the assignment, when the IIMA board decided to reconsider the method adopted until then in order to speed up the procedure to complete the campus. This concluded the collaboration with the NID and its staff of architects, and a site office directed by Anand Raje was established directly inside the campus in one of the completed dorms. Despite the same geographical distance that separated Khan from the construction site, the relationship already established with Raheja, who had worked for 5 years in Philadelphia, was the base for a more relaxed collaboration. But because of the geometrical and volumetric characteristics, the new buildings of the main complex around the courtyard required further checks from a structural point of view. The core, I'm quoting, have large spans, are high, and have stretches of wall with large unsupported lengths and height. And for those reasons, it was necessary to structurally reinforce the walls to reach a monolithic behavior against the horizontal forces generated by an earthquake. The third hypothesis proposed by the engineers relieved the masonry from its initial load-bearing role and transferred the loads to a reinforced concrete frame structure, which was then incorporated into the masonry. Even if Khan had adopted a similar solution in the Exeter Library, here in Ahmedabad, he refused to combine two different building systems. He wanted to preserve the nature of the masonry as a structural element. So the only effective solution consisted in building a reinforced masonry, which meant to insert steel bar inside the brickwork. How to do it, I mean from a technical side, was explored by Raheja. He knew that this technique that was already used in the Indian context appeared completely alien to the honesty in the use of the material stressed by Khan. But despite that, he had to identify 5 different possible solutions, as you can see them in the picture, from the quickest and economic to make, which is in the upper left corner of the image, to the most coherent one, bottom right, which, however, would have introduced a further problem. The full exposure of the concrete frame used to underline the presence of the metal reinforcement would have significantly changed the external appearance of the brick wall, seen as masses until that stage. According to Khan, technique, economics, and other circumstantial factors should have left space for architecture. Architecture should have always came first. This was actually what had happened in Ahmedabad up to that moment, thanks to the trust and respect the Indian architects showed towards him. So it was totally unexpected that in his answer to Raheja, Khan showed a new common sense, accepting the cheapest solution, even if less honest from an architectural point of view. These sentences are actually crucial, and I'm quoting. Altogether, let me say that I'm practical enough to see the point of view that the effectiveness of the steel within the wall begins to look to me like straw or coir that reinforces old plaster. And I'm quite willing to give in to what would keep the job going without undue effort, because we are already so far behind the schedule. What appears here as a passive acceptance of the most advantageous solution in terms of money, but especially time, needs to be traced back to the particular moment when this decision was taken. Also considering that in Dhaka, Khan had proven to know the more appropriate way of building reinforced masonry. The time delay needs here to be taken into account, such as the inevitable pressure put by the IIMA as an institution in Khan's decision to endorse a simpler technical execution. In the letter to Raheja cited before, Khan accompanied the explanation with an explicit reference to tradition that appears as he wanted to justify himself above all. The effectiveness of the steel within the wall begins to look to me like straw or coir that reinforces old plaster, he said. According to this original interpretation, the masonry again became a combination of only 2 elements, the brick and the binder, with an added peculiarity. The mortar joint
2 minutes, Alessandra.
Yes, I'm closing. The mortar joint had now a reinforcing element, just like it was straw in the plaster. As it was for bricks used as modules for the construction's control during the entire process, each technical choices related to the construction influenced the making of the Ahmedabad complex over time. But despite the proven constant awareness and control, visible and considerable effects of deterioration began to appear since the 90s, which means only 15 years after the construction of the buildings, showing the need of a premature restoration. But multiple factors can be stressed as causes or circumstances of this bad result. The poor quality clay used to make bricks and their consequent high porosity, the limited protection offered by the mortar joint to the steel reinforcement, and above all, the choice to reinforce the masonry that way, altogether work to be defined a recipe for a disaster. And here I'm quoting Sanji, an architect of the NID. The issue lies indeed within the construction itself and derives, as discussed before, from specific decisions taken during the process, which despite the geographical distance, Khan was always aware of. This knowledge, and I'm closing, raises then consideration on how priorities could be defined and on which possible methods could be applied in order to preserve the essence, if we would ever been able to define this essence, of the IIMA buildings, allowing them to continue their history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And can I ask all of our speakers to unmute and come on screen, please? Thank you. That was great to actually hear about 3 of your projects, this very thoughtful work about some of how some of these conservation dilemmas can actually be addressed in practice, and the sort of decisions that have to be made and traded off as part of that. And Alessandra, I thought that was such an interesting and wonderful insight into the making of the buildings, and I think a really good example of how this sort of deeper understanding about this affects how we understand and define significance. And of course, really highlights one of these really typical challenges. One of the most problematic areas of dealing with modern architecture often is this challenge of dealing with how to conserve or sustain material significance and authenticity. But through deep understanding, you can often find ways to resolve this. I think we have a couple of questions. But I'm just going to start off with one of them, actually, because it struck me that we had 3 institutional owners that we heard about in the case studies, different institutions. But I was interested to hear from each of you how important the identity of the institution was in relation to the architecture. You know, did the architecture itself have a role in how the institution sort of saw itself or its identity? And how that may have therefore impacted the owners' thinking about conservation or receptiveness to a conservation-based approach. And, you know, I think we've got sort of some different levels of that relationship is a little bit different in these 3 institutions. So I don't know who might want to jump in first, perhaps David.
I'm happy to start. Sure. The University of Pennsylvania, for all the troubles the Richards Labs gave them, they recognized that they had something unique and very special. And this was clearly articulated by the fact that they had it declared a National Historic Landmark, which is something that is very rare for an American institution to do. They usually, even if they acknowledge that they have important buildings and that they love these buildings, they don't want they don't want any outside regulatory apparatus telling them what to do. But Penn saw that this was really something clearly very special, and encouraged a heritage-based approach all along, at the same time acknowledging that it was a completely dysfunctional structure and needed on the inside to be largely rethought from a programmatic standpoint. And I think it was sort of, but it was having that balance and having considerable expertise on the client's side in terms of the people who were running the project and who consulted on the project, one of whom is on the webinar today, offered a lot of very interesting perspective and good advice as we went along, and really served as a source of encouragement that we were doing the right things and making what might be from a conservation standpoint on the interiors be considered a radical change, but really making the case that the laboratory partitions, even though they were original, were not. First of all, they weren't part of what Khan wanted for the building, but they were constantly in motion anyway. They were not a sort of fixed part of the building. These were things that were meant to be transitory, and so I think that and I think that, and as I say, from start to finish, it was an exemplary process with them.
Mm-hmm. Peter or Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yes, excuse me. What was so interesting looking at these buildings is how important they are as architecture. But to the clients, I remember one of the clients who was, she was one of the founding fellows at the Salk. She said, what a fantastic place the Salk is and the plaza is, but it's a wonderful place for architects to take photographs, but hopeless for scientists. And so obviously one does need to sort of be able to accommodate to needs of the building. And that's why it was so refreshing seeing what David was talking about, the Richards laboratories. But all the time one's sort of feeling that the difficulty is the pressure of successful institutions that successful institutions go putting on these buildings. And we had that at the Salk. One could see that with tremendous change in the planning of the buildings, the abandonment of the meeting house and the living accommodation, the development of overdevelopment of some additional accommodation going on right until the present time. And when I went to IIMA, I mean, the difficulty was seeing how wonderful the Khan campus was, and the way it extended, the diagonal grid extended through to the housing and the staff housing and the servants housing that sadly is now gone. That integrity from Khan's planning, interest in town planning was so important. And then you walk from that to the new campus and the horror of seeing it's done by design and build and with no architectural input, and how good it was to hear from one of the earlier speakers about the, how disappointing it was to go and stay there even one night in the new campus, whereas staying in the original was so good. And in our sort of, the Yale building, change could go ahead, but again, there's a resistance to doing that, because why change the building? Why not change your program? And I think that what happened at the Richards laboratories of changing the nature of the occupants was obviously a huge benefit. And what seems to be happening with the Yale Center, and why I think that's so successful, is that they've changed their program so that it works with the building, rather than saying we must fill in the lower court and build another wing, or we must go under the car park. That would just produce troglodyte type of accommodation, which would be anathema to Khan. And the other one, live with what you've got is the great thing.
Sarah, did you want to add anything
Sure. Just adding on Salk. Well, first of all, I would just add that I would say that the architecture is very important to the Salk Institute. Their old logo, which I'm sorry that has been redesigned, used to actually be an abstract version of the main plaza. So I think they realize what they have from what they have. A few things as it relates to the materials of the site. I think they have taken an approach to be quite, even before we were involved, in trying, when they needed to do repair and replacement, replicating it. But I think what this project introduced to them was this idea about material integrity and really digging into understanding the performance of the existing system. So I would also add that I agree with Peter in terms of the space planning. I think it's a bit more complicated there because of the pressures they're under for, more space for their research. Sometimes it works well for them. The facilities manager had upgraded all of the mechanical systems and found Khan's design of the laboratories to be quite accommodating and easy to work with in installing his new upgrades to the system. But when they're looking for more space, I think it's that balance of finding that balance between the best conservation approach and accommodating all of this demand at the Institute. One other additional thing I would add that's maybe interesting and unique or not unique to the Salk Institute is, by all accounts, it was a very collaborative design relationship between Dr. Salk and Khan. But for most people currently at the Institute, Dr. Salk is much more recent in their memories. So I remember the facilities manager we were working with, he would say, well, this is how Dr. Salk wanted to address problems. And so I think that was an interesting balance between, the architect's intentions and Dr. Salk's later intentions for the site.
Okay. We did have some questions in the chat, some of which people have already answered, and one that is going to be addressed tomorrow. And we are exactly on time. Oh, I'm allowed to go for a couple more minutes. I actually had a question for Alessandra, and it kind of relates to one of the questions in the chat, actually. And given that the work that you have been doing to provide this really deep and fascinating insight into the brick and the use of reinforced bricks and things, you won't be with us on the panel in the afternoon tomorrow. And I was interested, from your perspective, if you had to make a plea to the people conserving the building, and in relation to this question of materiality and material authenticity, where would you put your emphasis? What would your sort of consideration or your plea be to those taking on this challenge of dealing with this difficult technical issue?
Super hard question.
I know I'm really putting you on the spot here, but
almost impossible to answer to, actually. Also because I'm a researcher, but I'm also a professional that is dealing with restoration every day. So. But it's hard because if you think about the IIM, and the result of my studies from an historical perspective, but also if you think about the other studies that have been done from a technical side, you recognize the fact that the problem is within the construction itself. So it's very difficult to solve unless let's say in a very simple way, you start back with the construction and you do it in another way with different materials that are available in a easier way today than back then. For example, the stainless steel instead of just steel reinforcement that were used at that time. But this is just a general and theoretical approach that anybody can say that it's not right, but then we have to discuss about the importance of the image of the campus and what is actually really important. I mean, the idea of the campus, the idea behind the project of the campus, or the materiality of it, the original materials that was used at that time. I mean, that is always an open question in terms of conservation from ancient times. So it's difficult to go for an answer back further than this. I mean, and I don't know if I really answer, maybe not, but
no, that's great. Thank you. I mean, I think that's kind of a good note to stop. It's always this problem that we have in conservation, particularly, I think, as you said, for conservation of any era, but when we're dealing with modern heritage, we've often got this difficult balance that we have to deal with between the different aspects of significance, deciding which ones to prioritize because they're the most important, which ones we practically can accommodate, and how do we deal with the needs of the place to ensure that we sustain it into the future. So I think that might be a nice time to stop. I just want to say thank you very much to our session speakers this morning, to Alessandra, to Peter, to Sarah and David. And I am going to hand back to, who's closing out for me?
Annabel. Annabel would do.
Annabel, yes. Hi, Annabel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you
very
Susan.
much.
Thank you, Susan, for chairing that session. I will just take a minute to wrap up. First of all, I'd like to thank both our chairs, Prem, Chandavarkar and Susan, for chairing these two sessions today and making them very interesting, very engaging. A huge thank you to each of our speakers of both the sessions today for bringing out so many nuances of Khan's work, both at Ahmedabad as well as across the globe. It has been very interesting to hear the challenges that other campuses have faced and how they have dealt with these challenges. I think that should be an inspiration for the management at IIM to look, well, harder, if anything, for what may not be the perfect solution, but for some solution. And hope to see all of you today. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. And we look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. And lastly, thank you to my wonderful team here at NSC 20C, especially Kiran Joshi for putting together this webinar, and the team that has worked so hard on all the work at the background to make this event a success today. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. And
bye, everyone, and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.